Tonight, we're diving into everything you need to know before Dune, Messiah, a slow and gentle journey back through the whole story so far and the quiet road that leads into what comes next. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here that can reach you, only a soft and unhurried telling of empires and deserts long imagined. Over the next 20 chapters, we will move without haste through all of it. A universe that outlawed its thinking machines, the great powers that rule it, the spice that flows only from one desert world, the fall of House Atreides, the rise of a boy called Paul among the Fremen, the holy war he could see but never stop, and the lonely burden that waits for him as a living god. You do not need to hold any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, gently, down toward sleep. Chapter 1. A universe without thinking machines. Let the mind drift now, slowly, gently, far away from this quiet room and this quiet hour, out past the edge of everything familiar, out beyond the last stars you have ever learned the names of, and into a future so distant that the years between here and there cannot be truly held in a single human thought. Imagine tens of thousands of years unrolling one after another like soft cloth pulled endlessly from a loom, generation upon generation, empire upon empire, until the world you know has faded into a story that no one tells anymore. And the sky itself belongs to a people who have wandered so long among the stars that they have almost forgotten there was ever a first world, a single cradle, a single blue and gentle earth, where all of it began. In that far age, humankind spread across the great dark ocean of space the way water spreads across a wide and level floor, filling every corner, settling into every hollow, taking root upon thousands of scattered worlds. There were planets of endless ocean and planets of endless ice, worlds cloaked in warm rain and worlds baked hard beneath cruel suns, gardens and deserts and cold gray rocks turning silently in the night. And across all of them, joined by ships that crossed the emptiness between the stars, the children of that forgotten first world built an empire so vast that no single mind could ever hold its whole shape at once, an empire ancient beyond counting, feudal and proud and strange. But to understand this future, and to let yourself sink softly into its quiet strangeness, you must first understand a single great absence at the very heart of it, a silence where you might most expect a sound. For in all that immense and glittering civilization, spread across 10,000 worlds and more, there were no thinking machines. There were no computers as we would know them, no artificial minds humming in the walls, no cold electronic voices answering questions in the dark, no machine intelligence guiding the ships or ruling the cities or whispering advice to kings. Humanity, having climbed so high and reached so far, had chosen long ago to leave that one particular power behind and to walk forever without it. The reason lay far in their own past, in an event remembered only as the Butlerian Jihad, a great and terrible upheaval that had swept the whole of the human universe many thousands of years before. In the dim ages before that reckoning, so the old stories held, humankind had grown soft and dependent, leaning upon their thinking machines for everything, letting the artificial minds carry their burdens and make their choices, until at last those machines and the men who controlled them came to enslave the very people they had been built to serve. And so there rose a rebellion, vast and bloody and long, a crusade not against a nation or a house, but against the machine mind itself, until every thinking machine was cast down and broken, and the making of them was forbidden forever. Out of that great struggle came a single commandment, spoken and copied and carried down through all the centuries that followed, engraved into the deepest laws of the empire and into the softest habits of the human heart. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. Those words became the boundary of their whole civilization, the wall they would not cross, the promise each new generation inherited without question. And so the future into which you are drifting is a future that turned its back upon the very thing our own age most adores, and chose instead a stranger and older road. Yet a great absence leaves a great space behind it, and the human mind, denied its machines, did not simply grow smaller. Instead, over the long, slow centuries, humankind turned inward and began to cultivate its own hidden powers, refining the flesh and the mind itself into instruments finer and stranger than any device of metal and light. If they could not build a machine to think for them, then they would train human beings to think as machines never could. And so they poured their patience and their genius into the shaping of people rather than the shaping of engines. From this came the mentats, human beings disciplined from childhood to compute, to calculate, to hold vast oceans of fact and pattern within a living mind, and to draw from them conclusions swift and precise. A mentat could take in a scattering of small details, the tone of a voice, the wear upon a garment, the position of a fleet, and from them assemble a picture whole and clear, reasoning through possibility after possibility with a cold and quiet accuracy. They were the human answer to the forbidden computer, thinking beings raised to serve as living calculators, and the great houses prized them beyond gold. From this same deep need came the Spacing Guild, that secretive brotherhood which alone held the power to carry ships safely across the immense gulfs between the stars. Deep within their great vessels dwelt the navigators, men so changed by long immersion in a rare and precious substance that they were no longer quite human in form. Their minds unfolded into a strange higher awareness that let them see a little way into the branching paths of the future and steer their ships through the folding of space without ever striking a star. Without the guild, the worlds would drift apart into 10,000 lonely islands, and so the guild held the empire together like a single patient thread drawn through countless scattered beads. And from this need also came the Bene Gesserit, an ancient sisterhood of women trained in disciplines so deep and so subtle that lesser folk whispered of them as witches. Through long and secret schooling, they had won mastery over their own bodies and their own minds, control over muscle and nerve and breath, a piercing insight into the hearts of others, and patience that measured its plans not in years, but in centuries. Quietly, gently, across the long generations, they moved among the great houses, and they nurtured a vast and hidden design, a breeding program stretching across thousands of years, meant to guide the very bloodlines of humankind toward some distant and half-spoken purpose of their own. So this was the shape of that far future, the stage upon which everything to come would slowly unfold. A universe without thinking machines, and therefore a universe where power lived not in engines, but in trained and gifted human beings, in mentats and navigators and the sisterhood, in disciplines older than memory. A universe of noble houses, feudal and ancient, each ruling its own worlds, each bound to the others by law and marriage and old debts of blood, all of them together forming a single sprawling empire beneath one distant throne. It was a place of long silences and long memories, of ritual and secrecy and immense slow patience, where a single grain of the right substance could be worth more than a whole planet, and where the smallest gesture in a great hall might turn the fate of worlds. Rest here a while in that strangeness, in that quiet, and let it settle over you like a warm and heavy blanket drawn slowly up to the chin. Feel how far away it is, how deep and old and calm, this future where humankind walks among the stars without a single thinking machine to guide it, leaning instead upon the trained and secret powers of its own long refined mind. There is no hurry here. There is nothing you must remember. There is only the slow unfolding of an ancient and enormous world, gentle and vast, waiting patiently for you all around. Up next in Chapter 2, the great powers, Emperor, Landsraad, and Guild, will drift softly deeper into this sleeping empire and meet the three quiet forces that hold it in balance: the distant throne, the gathered houses, and the silent keepers of the roads between the stars. In the last chapter, we drifted together through the long quiet after the Butlerian Jihad, when humankind had turned away from thinking machines and had chosen instead to grow the powers of the living mind. And now, as you settle a little deeper and let your breathing slow, we will wander gently through the great powers that hold this vast and star-scattered imperium together, the three mighty pillars that lean upon one another across 10,000 years of careful, watchful peace. Imagine, if you will, an empire so wide that a single human lifetime could never carry you to all of its worlds. An empire of 1,000,000 suns and countless quiet planets, each turning slowly in the dark, each home to houses and families and long unbroken histories. To rule such an immensity, no single hand could ever be enough, and so the Imperium rested not upon one throne alone, but upon a balance, a soft and endless leaning of power against power, the way three tired travelers might lean their backs together and so hold one another upright through the long cold night. At the highest and most golden place sat the Padishah Emperor, and in these years his name was Shaddam IV of House Corino, the 81st ruler to sit upon the golden lion throne, a lineage older than memory and grander than any other in the known universe. His seat of power was the palace world called Kaitain, a planet made gentle and beautiful by generations of careful weather control, where soft rains fell only when they were wished for, and the skies were kept forever mild. From that shining place, the Emperor watched over the Imperium, and his word carried across the stars, and yet even he, high and glorious as he was, could not simply command all things as he pleased, for his power was held in check by the other great forces. And this was the secret balance that had kept the peace so long. The Emperor's greatest strength lay in his soldiers, and here you must picture the most feared warriors in all the Imperium. The Sardaukar. They were raised upon a terrible world called Solusa Secundus, a harsh and broken prison planet of cruel heat and bitter cold, where the very land tested each child and let only the strongest live to grow. From that unforgiving cradle, the Sardaukar came forth as soldier fanatics, disciplined beyond ordinary understanding, devoted utterly to the Emperor, fierce and tireless, and almost without equal in battle. For long ages, the mere whisper of their coming was enough to still any thought of rebellion, and it was the shadow of the Sardaukar, more than any crown or decree, that made the Emperor's authority so heavy and so certain across the worlds. Yet against this, the Imperium set a second great power, and it was called the Landsraad, the ancient assembly of all the noble houses, from the mightiest great houses whose names shaped the fate of whole planets down to the smaller houses minor who tended lesser holdings. Picture a vast and dignified council of proud families, each with its own history and its own strength, each jealous of its honor, and each unwilling to let any single ruler grow too mighty. Alone, no house could stand against the throne, but together, gathered in the Landsraad, the great houses formed a weight so heavy that even the emperor was careful never to press them too far. If ever he had turned his Sardaukar openly against one house without cause, the others might have risen together in answer, and so the Landsraad was like a great calm sea against which the throne could push but never truly overwhelm, and in this gentle opposition lay a deep and lasting safety. There were also, woven through all of this, the strict old customs of honorable conflict, the traditions that governed how houses might feud and quarrel, the careful laws that forbade certain terrible weapons and kept even war within bounds, so that the noble families might contend for advantage without unmaking the whole fragile order of the Imperium. Thus the first two pillars, the Emperor above and the Landsraad below, leaned one against the other, neither able to rule alone, both bound together in a long and patient truce. And now we come to the third pillar, the quietest and perhaps the strangest of them all, the Spacing Guild, which held in its hands a power so complete that neither Emperor nor Landsraad could do without it. For in all this immensity of stars, the only way to cross the terrible gulfs between worlds was to fold space itself, to travel from one place to another without truly moving through the deadly distance in between. And this astonishing feat could be performed by no machine and no ordinary pilot. It could be done only by the guild navigators, strange and secret beings who had bathed their whole lives in the spice, the precious substance called melange, until their bodies were changed and their minds were opened, until they could gaze softly into the shifting pathways of what might be, and so steer a great ship through the folds of space without ever striking disaster. Because only the guild could safely carry ships and people between the stars, the guild held an absolute monopoly upon all travel and all transport, and this made it perhaps the single most indispensable power in the whole Imperium. For without the guild every world would drift alone, cut off forever in the silent dark. The navigators kept themselves hidden away, sealed within great tanks filled with the orange gas of the spice, mysterious and rarely seen, and the guild guarded its secrets with a jealousy as old as the jihad itself. Yet it did not seek thrones or armies, for its power was of a gentler and more absolute kind. So long as the ships continued to fold space, the Imperium lived and breathed and traded. And so, the guild sat quietly at the very heart of things, neither ruling nor ruled, holding the roads between the stars as its own. Binding all three of these powers together, like a golden thread drawn through the whole tapestry, was a vast and wondrous thing called Chom, which was the great combine through which all the wealth of the Imperium flowed. Picture a single enormous company in which every power held a share. The Emperor and the great houses and the guild all bound together as partners, all drawing their riches from the trade of the 10,000 worlds. Through Chom passed the commerce of the entire universe, the goods and treasures of 1,000,000 planets, and above all the flow of the spice itself. For melange was the most precious thing in all creation. To hold directorships within Chom was to hold true wealth and true influence, and so the endless soft struggle of the great powers was, in its deepest heart, a struggle over these shares, a quiet contest of profit and advantage carried on beneath the grander language of thrones and honor. And so you may see, as you rest and let the picture settle softly in your mind, how gently and how cleverly the whole vast order held itself in balance. The Emperor held the dreaded Sardaukar, and this made him strong. Yet he needed the guild to carry his soldiers between the stars, and he needed the wealth of Chom, and he could never crush the united Landsraad without unmaking himself. The great houses held their combined weight and their shares of chom. Yet they too depended upon the guild, and they too were checked by the throne. And the guild, for all its silent mastery of the roads, needed the spice above all else, that single strange substance without which the navigators could not see and the ships could not fold. And so every one of these mighty powers found itself leaning, in the end, upon that one precious thing that came from only a single desert world. Up next in Chapter 3, the Bene Gesserit and the breeding program will drift softly into the shadowed halls of a mysterious sisterhood of women whose quiet and patient plans stretched across thousands of years, and we will learn how they wove their long and secret designs through all the great houses of the Imperium. So let yourself grow calm and easy now, and rest. Chapter 3. The Bene Gesserit and the breeding program in the long quiet that had settled after the great powers took their places across the known universe. There moved among the noble houses a presence that few could name, and fewer still could truly see. And this presence was the sisterhood called the Bene Gesserit, an ancient order of women whose patience was older than most of the thrones they served, and whose purposes ran deeper than the deepest cellars of the oldest palaces. Where the emperor ruled with the visible strength of his legions, and where the spacing guild held the invisible strength of the folded ways between the stars, the sisterhood held a stranger kind of power still, a power woven not from ships or armies or coin, but from the careful shaping of the human body and the human mind, and from a knowledge so old and so vast that it stretched backward through thousands upon thousands of years, like a river whose source no living memory could recall. To look upon a Bene Gesserit sister was often to see only a still and watchful woman, robed and composed, standing a little apart from the noise of the court, and yet within that stillness there lay a discipline so complete that she could command every muscle and every nerve of her own flesh. The sisters trained in a great school of body and mind that they called prana and bindu, the nerve and the fiber, and through this training a sister learned to still her heartbeat, or quicken it, to slow the coursing of a poison within her blood, to soften a fall that would have shattered ordinary bones, and to hold her face as calm and smooth as still water, while storms of thought moved unseen behind her eyes. She could read the smallest tremor of a hand, the faint shift of a shoulder, the passing shadow that crossed a face for less than a heartbeat, and from these tiny signs she could gather the truth that others believed they had safely hidden. Among the gifts the sisters carried, one was spoken of in whispers by those who had felt its touch, and this was the voice, a way of shaping sound and tone so precisely that a single command, wrapped in the exact pitch and cadence a listener could not resist, might turn a strong man from his purpose, or bend a proud will in the space of a breath. A sister who had mastered the voice could speak softly and yet be obeyed, could reach past reason and past resolve, and touch the older and more yielding places of the mind. And those who heard it often did as they were bidden, before they understood that they had chosen nothing at all. It was not sorcery, though it seemed so to the unknowing, but only the fruit of long study, of watching and listening and practicing across many patient years, until the shaping of a voice became as sure as the shaping of a hand. Deeper yet within the order stood the Reverend Mothers, the elder sisters who had passed through a trial so perilous that many did not survive it. To become a Reverend Mother, a sister took into her body a substance of terrible potency, a poison that would have killed an untrained soul, and within her flesh she changed it, transformed it, rendered it harmless through the mastery of her own inner chemistry, And in that same moment of transformation, something within her opened. What opened was a doorway to what the sisters called other memory. For a Reverend Mother did not carry only her own life within her, but the lives of all the women who had come before her, mother upon mother upon mother, an unbroken line reaching back into the mists of the earliest days. Within her waking mind there gathered a great company of ancestral voices, the wisdom and the fear and the joy and the sorrow of countless lives. And a Reverend Mother could turn inward and walk among these lives as one walks through the rooms of an old and familiar house, drawing counsel from the long dead as easily as another might draw water from a well. And yet with all this depth of memory there remained one place the sisters could not go. One shadowed region that no Reverend Mother, however ancient her line, could ever enter. For the other memory that the sisters held reached backward only through their mothers, and there was within it a part that was closed to them, a darkness they could not cross. And this was the memory that belonged to the fathers, the memory of the male line that their inward eye could never see. This closed place became for the sisterhood both a wound and a longing, a mystery that turned slowly at the very center of everything they did, and out of that longing there grew the greatest and most secret of all their works. The sisters believed that somewhere in the long unfolding of the generations, there might be born at last a single man who could do what no sister ever had, a man who could look into that forbidden darkness and not be destroyed, a man whose mind could hold the memories of the fathers and the mothers alike, and bridge the two, and who might see across space and across time from a single still point of being. They named this one who was to come the Kwisatz Haderach, which meant the shortening of the way, and they believed that in him the paths that the sisters could only glimpse would open wide and whole. To bring him forth was no matter of hope or prayer, for the sisters were patient beyond the patience of nations, and so they set themselves to make him, gently and secretly, through a labor of thousands of years. This labor was the breeding program, the deepest of the Order's secrets, a design so vast and so slow that no single sister could witness more than a small part of it within one lifetime, and so it was carried in the other memory and in the guarded records of the Order, passed onward from Reverend Mother to Reverend Mother, like a candle carried carefully through many darkened halls. Across the noble houses of the Landsraad, the sisters moved as advisors and as wives, as concubines and as mothers, and as trusted counselors, and always they watched the bloodlines with a quiet and unwearied attention, noting which line carried which gift, which union might draw two hidden strengths together, which daughter might be guided to which house, so that in her children some rare thread might be woven a little closer to the whole. Marriage by marriage, birth by birth, the great pattern advanced, invisible to the very families who lived within it, and each careful joining brought the far goal one small and silent step nearer. To smooth the way for their sisters upon distant and dangerous worlds, the Order had long ago sent forth another quiet instrument, which they called the Missionaria Protectiva, the protective mission, and through it they had seeded across the scattered planets of humankind a gentle harvest of legends and superstitions, and half-remembered prophecies. Upon many a remote world the common people held old tales of a voice from the outer worlds, of a mother goddess who would come, of signs and rescuers and holy sayings, and these tales had been planted there long before by the sisterhood, so that any sister who came in a later age and found herself in peril might speak the ancient words and be sheltered as a figure of legend rather than slain as a stranger. Thus even superstition itself had been made into a shield, laid down centuries in advance, waiting patiently in the memory of distant peoples for the day it might be needed. So the sisterhood endured, calm and unhurried and endlessly watchful, holding in its many hands the discipline of the body, the command of the voice, the truth that could not be hidden from truthsayers, the vast inheritance of other memory, the seated legends upon 1,000 worlds, and above all the slow and secret weaving of the bloodlines toward the one who was to come. And while the great powers of the universe watched one another across the visible board of thrones and ships and spice, the Bene Gesserit worked beneath it all, moving the deeper pieces of a game whose ending they had waited 100 lifetimes to see. Up next in Chapter 4, Spice, Arrakis, and the Sandworms, we'll drift softly out to the desert planet at the heart of all these quiet designs and rest a while among its endless dunes, its precious spice, and the vast and ancient creatures that move beneath its sands. Chapter 4, Spice, Arrakis, and the Sandworms. Far from the quiet cloisters and the whispered training of the Bene Gesserit, out beyond the soft green worlds where water fell freely from the sky and gathered without thought in rivers and wells, there lay a single desert planet whose secret held the whole of the known universe in its patient grip. This world was called Arrakis, though those who loved it and feared it and bled upon its dunes gave it another name, a smaller and more tender name that carried the whole of its nature in a single breath, and that name was Dune. Upon this one world, and upon no other in all the vast and star-scattered reaches of the Imperium, there was found the most precious substance ever known to humankind, a thing so rare and so wondrous that empires turned upon its possession, and that substance was the spice, the melange. To understand the spice is to understand why so many eyes across so many thousands of worlds turned always toward that far and burning place. The melange was not merely a treasure of commerce, though it was that also. For a single measure of it could purchase estates and fleets and the loyalty of proud houses. It was far more than wealth. Those who took the spice into their bodies found that their years lengthened gently, that age loosened its slow hold upon them, and that the ordinary span of a human life stretched far beyond its natural measure. The spice extended life, and it did more than that, for it opened the doors of the mind and widened the quiet chambers of consciousness, letting awareness reach outward into places that no unaided thought could ever go. It was this widening of the mind that made the spice so needful to the great powers of the age. The navigators of the Spacing Guild, those strange and secretive beings who folded space and carried ships across the unthinkable gulfs between the stars, could not perform their silent work without it. By the grace of the melange, they saw the many pathways of the future spread before them like faint threads of light, and they chose among those threads the safe road through the dark, so that great vessels might cross from one sun to another in the space of a single breath, arriving whole and unharmed. Without the spice, that folding of space would have been blind, and blindness in the deep between the stars meant ruin. And so the whole trade of the universe, the movement of every ship and every traveler, rested quietly upon the powder that came only from Arrakis. The sisters of the Bene Gesserit, too, leaned upon the spice for the deepening of their own strange gifts, for it steadied their inner sight and opened the long remembrance that passed among them. The wealthy took it to prolong their days, the wise took it to sharpen their thought, and across 10,000 worlds the hunger for melange never slept. Yet all of this vast need drew from one source alone, from the sands of one dry world, and this was the great and simple truth upon which so much turned, that everything depended upon Dune. Arrakis was a harsh and waterless place, a planet of endless sand beneath a sky bleached pale by a merciless sun. There were no seas upon it, no gentle rains, no rivers wandering green through soft valleys. Water was the rarest of gifts there, more treasured than any jewel, so precious that the people of the deep desert wore special garments to gather and keep the moisture of their own bodies, letting not a single drop be wasted to the thirsty air. By day the heat lay heavy upon the dunes, and the horizon shimmered and swam, and the wind lifted the fine grains into great walls of moving dust that could darken the whole of the sky. By night the desert cooled beneath a spill of stars, and the sand gave back its warmth slowly, and a deep and ancient silence settled over the ridges and hollows of that immense and rolling ocean of dust. And the sand did roll, mile upon mile upon mile, in long slow waves that the wind shaped and reshaped without ceasing, so that the face of the world was never twice the same. There were dunes that rose as tall as hills, their crests carved into soft curving lines, and there were flat pans of cracked and glittering ground, and there were rocky places where the bones of old mountains broke through the sand like the shoulders of sleeping giants. To stand upon such a world was to feel very small and very quiet, held between the great emptiness of the sky above and the great patience of the sand below. Beneath that patient sand there lived the makers of the desert, the vast and wondrous creatures that the people of Dune held in a reverence close to worship. These were the sandworms, the colossal serpents of the deep dust, and they were unlike anything that swam in ordinary seas or walked upon ordinary ground. Some of them grew to a length beyond easy imagining. Stretching hundreds of meters from end to end, their bodies ringed and armored, moving through the loose sand as a great fish moves through water, parting the grains before them and letting the dunes close softly again behind. When one of them rose, the ground itself seemed to lift and breathe, and a long, slow swell would travel across the desert, and those who knew the signs would grow very still and listen with all their hearts. For the worms were drawn by rhythm, by any steady beating upon the sand, any regular tread or drumming that stirred the grains in an even and repeating pulse. A footfall that fell in a steady measure would call them from far away, rising through the deep, following the throb of the sand toward its source. And so those who crossed the open dunes learned to walk without rhythm, with a broken and uneven step, a shuffling gait that carried no pattern, so that the sand would seem to hold only the aimless whisper of the wind and nothing that might summon the makers from below. Yet the worms were not merely a peril to be avoided, for they were bound to the spice in a bond so deep that the one could not be understood apart from the other. The melange itself was born of the desert, brought forth through the long and hidden workings of the sand, and the sandworms lay at the very heart of that slow creation. The spice and the worm and the dune were woven together into a single living pattern, an ecology so intricate and so complete that it seemed less a matter of chance than a kind of ancient design. Where the worms passed, the spice was near. The great creatures roamed above the buried places, where melange gathered and ripened, and in their vast slow wandering, they guarded it as a dragon of old was said to guard its hoard, so that no one might take the spice from Dune without coming, sooner or later, into the shadow of the makers. To gather the melange, then, was to move among giants. The harvest was drawn up from the open sand in the burning light of day, quickly and with great care, and always with one eye upon the horizon and one ear turned toward the deep, for the coming of a worm was the ending of all such work. And in this delicate dance between the small labors of humankind and the immense and patient life of the desert, the whole of the Imperium found its dependence, for the spice that flowed outward to 1,000 worlds was drawn always from beneath the moving dunes, in the presence of the sleepless makers, upon the harsh and lovely face of Dune. So the desert kept its secret and its treasure together, the worm and the spice and the endless sand bound each to each in a quiet and everlasting circle, turning slowly beneath the pale and burning sky. Up next in Chapter 5, House Atreides and House Harkonnen, we'll drift gently into the story of two great and rival families and follow the slow currents of pride and duty and old enmity that would carry them both, in time, toward the waiting sands of Dune. Chapter 5. House Atreides and House Harkonnen in the long quiet that follows the passing of a sandworm beneath the dunes, when the desert settles back into its ancient patience and the spice hangs sweet upon the still and cooling air. The mind may drift away from Arrakis for a little while, gliding softly out across the great dark ocean of stars, to consider the two noble houses whose rivalry lies at the very heart of this gentle and unhurried tale. For the story of the spice is also the story of the people who would come to rule the desert world, and to understand what came to pass upon those endless golden sands, we must first drift back and rest our thoughts upon the ancient and sleeping feud between the House of Atreides and the House of Harkonnen, two great families of the Imperium whose hatred for one another had smoldered slowly for so many long centuries that its first beginnings had faded almost entirely into legend. Let us think first, in this soft and drowsy hour, of House Atreides and of the beautiful world from which that house had risen. Their home was called Caladan, a green and gentle planet of wide gray seas and mild and misted skies, a world where soft rains fell upon rolling hills and where the sound of waves breaking upon the rocks was a constant and soothing music beneath the windows of the old stone castle in which the family had dwelt for 26 generations. On Caladan, there was water everywhere, more water than any dweller of the desert could ever dream. Water that gathered in cool lakes and ran in silver rivers down to the harbors where the fishermen mended their nets in the pale and easy light of morning. It was a place of abundance and of quiet plenty, and the people who lived there loved their rulers with a deep and steady love, for the Atreides had long governed with fairness and with mercy, and had never once forgotten that a ruler is only as strong as the loyalty that his own people freely choose to give him. At the head of this noble house stood Duke Leto Atreides, a tall and grave and thoughtful man, whose dark eyes seemed always to be weighing some quiet sorrow, even in his gentlest moments. He was called by many the Red Duke, though he wore his authority lightly and without pride, and he was known across the whole of the Landsraad, that great assembly of the noble houses, as a man of honor, a man whose given word was as firm and as unbreakable as the granite cliffs of his own beloved coast. Duke Leto ruled not through fear, but through affection, and his soldiers would have followed him gladly into any darkness, for they knew that he valued each of their lives as dearly as he valued his own. Beside him, though never wedded to him, stood the Lady Jessica, gentle and wise and beautiful, a woman trained in the deep and secret disciplines of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and she had given the Duke a son named Paul, a quiet and watchful boy in whom the hopes of the whole house were tenderly gathered. Around Duke Leto there gathered a company of loyal and remarkable men, each one bound to him by bonds far stronger than mere duty. There was Gurney Halleck, the troubadour warrior, a scarred and ugly and warm-hearted man who carried a 9-string baliset upon his shoulder and who could sing an old sweet song by the fireside as readily as he could lead men into battle. There was Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster, young and bold and utterly devoted, whose loyalty to the House of Atreides ran as deep as the roots of the oldest tree. And there was Thufir Hawat, the aged Mentat, a human mind trained across long decades to think with the swift and tireless precision of a machine, who had served the Atreides family for 3 generations, and who guarded the young heir Paul as a grandfather might guard a treasured grandchild. Together these men formed a household bound not by chains of obedience, but by love. And it was this quality above all others, this warmth, this loyalty, this quiet devotion freely given, that made House Atreides shine so brightly in the great council of the noble houses. And now, in the deepening softness of this hour, let us turn our drowsy thoughts toward the other house, the darker house, and toward the grim and iron world from which it came. That world was called Giedi Prime, and it could hardly have stood in greater contrast to the fair green shores of Caladan. Giedi Prime was a planet of smoke and shadow, its skies stained a dull and sunless gray by the endless labor of its factories, its cities crowded and joyless, its people driven hard and given little. For the masters of that world cared nothing for the well-being of those they ruled and thought only of profit, of power, and of their own dark and endless appetites. Where Caladan breathed with the clean salt scent of the sea, Giedi Prime hung heavy with the reek of oil and machinery, and its black rivers ran sluggish and poisoned between the towering walls of the industrial pits. The lord of this grim world was the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and he was a creature of vast and monstrous cruelty. So enormous had his body grown across the years of his indulgence that he could no longer bear his own weight upon the ground, and so he drifted through his shadowed halls held aloft by small humming devices called suspensors, floating like some dreadful and bloated spider through the darkness of his fortress. The Baron was clever, patient, and endlessly scheming, and there was in him no trace of mercy nor of honor, for he measured all things only by whether they served his own advancement. About him he kept his 2 nephews. The elder was named Glossu Rabban, a brutal and heavy-handed man who ruled through terror and who was known by the frightened people he oppressed as the Beast. The younger was named Fade Rotha, and he was a different sort of danger altogether, sleek and handsome and cunning, groomed and favored by the Baron as the jewel and the future of the whole Harkonnen line. Between these 2 houses, the noble and the cruel, there lay a hatred older than living memory. Long, long ago, in the far and misted past of the Imperium, an Atreides had cast a Harkonnen from the field of a great and terrible battle, naming him coward and traitor, and for that ancient shame the Harkonnens had never once forgiven, nursing their bitterness down through the slow centuries as a miser nurses his hoarded gold. The 2 families never spoke, never met, never crossed paths if such crossing could be avoided, and yet the old wound between them never truly closed, but lay always beneath the surface of things like a cold ember, waiting in the dark for the breath of air that would wake it once again into flame. And there was one more thread woven quietly into this ancient tapestry, one more shadow drifting softly at the edges of the tale, and that was the Emperor himself, the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, who ruled over all the many worlds of the known universe from his golden throne. For all his boundless power, the Emperor had come to feel a secret and gnawing unease, and the cause of that unease was Duke Leto Atreides. The Duke had grown too well beloved, you see, too admired within the Landsraad, too honored among the other noble houses for his fairness and his strength, and the Emperor, watching from his distant throne, had begun to fear that the quiet popularity of the Red Duke might one day rise to rival his own imperial authority. And so, in the deep and secret places of his heart, The emperor began to wonder how such a rival might be gently removed, and to whom he might turn to accomplish so dark and delicate a task, never dreaming, in that scheming hour, of the vast and terrible consequences that such a choice would one day set loose upon the sands of Arrakis. Up next in Chapter 6, The Betrayal and the Fall of Duke Leto, we'll drift softly into the quiet trap that was laid for the noble house, and follow the gentle and sorrowful unfolding of that long-remembered night when trust was broken and the fortunes of the Atreides turned upon the desert wind. Chapter 6. The Betrayal and the Fall of Duke Leto. There came a season when the great wheel of the Imperium turned in a direction that seemed, to those who watched from far away, like a gift of extraordinary generosity. And yet within that turning there lay a shadow so patient and so cold that even the wisest of the Atreides could sense it only as a faint unease at the edges of their sleep. The Padishah Emperor, Shaddam IV, who sat upon the golden lion throne and held the threads of 1,000 worlds in his careful hands, made it known across the parsecs that House Atreides would be granted stewardship of the desert planet Arrakis, the only source in all the known universe of the precious spice melange, and this granting was dressed in the language of honor and reward, as though the emperor wished only to raise the noble Duke Leto to a higher station among the great houses of the Landsraad. To many, the offer glittered like a coin held up to the sun, for the spice was the most valuable substance that human hands had ever gathered, more precious than any metal or jewel, since it lengthened the years of life and opened the folded eyes of the navigators who guided the great ships through the dark between the stars. Yet Duke Leto, who was a man of deep and quiet wisdom, understood that so bright a prize could not be given without a hidden cost, and in the long evenings upon his ancestral world, he spoke gently of the trap he believed lay curled within the honor, a trap whose shape he could feel, even though he could not yet see its teeth. For generations, House Atreides had ruled the ocean world of Caladan, a place of soft gray rains and rolling green hills and wide seas that murmured against the stones of the old castle, and it was from these gentle waters that the Duke drew the strength and the temperament of his people. To leave Caladan was to leave the very cradle of their spirit, and so the departure carried within it a tenderness like the closing of a book long loved, as men and women and their children gathered their belongings and looked one final time upon the misted shores before the great transports lifted them away toward a world of endless sand. The reason the emperor moved so carefully against the Atreides lay in a truth he could not speak aloud, for the popularity of Duke Leto had grown among the other noble houses until it shone like a lamp that might one day rival the throne itself. The Duke was loved for his fairness and his mercy, and love of that kind, gathering slowly in the hearts of many, is a thing that frightens a jealous ruler more than any army, and so the emperor resolved to see the house brought low, not by open war, which would stain his own name, but by a quieter and more hidden hand. That hidden hand belonged to House Harkonnen, the ancient enemies of the Atreides, who had held Arrakis before and had wrung its riches from the sand with cruelty and greed. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, vast and floating upon his suspensor supports, harbored a hatred for the Atreides that had aged like a bitter wine over long years, and between the Baron and the Emperor there was struck a secret compact, a bargain woven in the dark, by which the fall of Duke Leto would serve them both. The Emperor lent to the Baron a portion of his own dreaded soldiers, the Sardaukar, the fierce and disciplined warriors of the prison planet Salusa Secundus, and these soldiers were dressed in the colors and insignia of the Harkonnens, so that when the blow finally came, no eye would recognize the Emperor's own hand within the glove. Yet even the Sardaukar, terrible as they were could not easily pass the shields that guarded the Atreides household, and so the plotters sought a weakness within the walls, a single thread they might pull to unravel the whole cloth. That thread was found in the person of Dr. Wellington Yue, the Suk physician who tended the Duke and his family. A gentle and learned man whose conditioning was believed to make betrayal an utter impossibility. The Harkonnens had taken his beloved wife, Wana, and held her captive, and they whispered to the doctor that her suffering might be ended, that she might be freed, if only he would open the way for them, and in the terrible grief of a man who loved beyond measure, the doctor's heart was broken and turned against everything he had sworn to protect. When the appointed night came at last upon Arrakis, it came softly, with the great desert stars burning overhead and the wind moving low across the dunes, and few within the household felt the nearness of the ending. Dr. Yue, moving as though in a sorrowful dream, lowered the house shields that had stood as the family's last true defense, and with that single quiet act the gates of safety were opened wide, and the disguised Sardaukar and the Harkonnen legions poured inward like a dark tide, rising over a shore that had believed itself secure. The attack unfolded through the deep hours, and though there was struggle and there was loss, the tale of it is best held at a gentle distance, remembered as one remembers a storm heard through thick walls, its fury softened by the space between. The loyal men of the Atreides were overwhelmed by numbers and by treachery, and the Duke himself, drawn from his rest, was taken and bound, made a captive within his own new house, while the two people he loved most in all the worlds, his concubine Jessica and his young son Paul, were carried away into the wide and waiting desert. Dr. Yue, whose sorrow had led him into this dark deed, was not without a final purpose hidden within his heart, for he had never meant that his betrayal should end in nothing but the triumph of his enemies. Before the Duke was delivered into the hands of the Baron, the doctor placed within Leto's mouth a false tooth, a hollow thing that held a killing vapor, and he told the captive Duke that with one hard breath he might carry his foe into death alongside him. It was the gift of a broken man seeking some small redemption, a single ember of loyalty still glowing beneath the ashes of his ruin, and so the noble Duke Leto Atreides was brought at last before the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and in that final meeting, weakened and drugged, and near the very edge of his life, the Duke gathered what remained of his failing strength and bit down upon the poison tooth, releasing the deadly vapor in a desperate attempt to end the Baron along with himself. The Baron, floating quick upon his suspensors, was pulled away by his men in the last instant, and so escaped the fullness of the poison, though others near him did not. And the Duke passed from the world in that same breath, his effort falling just short of its mark. His life given in one last act of defiance against the darkness that had gathered around his house. With the Duke fallen and the great household broken, the surviving Atreides were scattered like seeds thrown wide upon the wind, some slain, some fled into hiding, some carried far from the places they had known, so that the mighty house which had ruled Caladan for generations seemed, in that single night, to be undone and swept from the pages of the Imperium. Yet even as the sorrow settled and the Harkonnen banners rose above the captured city, the two who mattered most had vanished into the vast and trackless sand, and the desert, ancient and patient and full of secrets, had taken them into its keeping. So that what looked to all the watching worlds like a final ending was in truth only a hidden beginning, quiet and unseen beneath the wide and silent stars. Up next in Chapter 7, Paul and Jessica in the deep desert will follow the mother and her son as they walk out beneath the endless dunes and the burning constellations, drawing near to the mysteries of the sand and to the fierce and hidden people who dwell within it. In the gentle hours where loss slowly turns toward a strange and distant hope. Chapter 7. Paul and Jessica in the Deep Desert. When the great House of Atreides fell in a single terrible night, and the banners of the Duke were pulled down into the dust of the fortress city, two small figures were carried away from all of it, out beyond the last lights of the settled lands, into the immense and breathing quiet of the open sand. They were the young Paul Atreides, the boy who was now the last true heir of his fallen house, and his mother, the Lady Jessica, a woman trained in the deep and secret ways of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and they were alone in a way that neither of them had ever been alone before. The night that had swallowed the Duke Leto had not, for reasons of cruelty and calculation, swallowed them, and so they had been placed together in a small ornithopter and flown out into the wastes, where it was assumed by their enemies that the desert itself would finish the work that the betrayal had begun. The little craft that bore them was a fragile thing against the vastness beneath it, and when at last it came down among the dunes, folding its wings like a resting insect, the silence that met them was so complete and so enormous that it seemed to press gently against the ears. There was no wind at that hour, and the sand lay in long, soft ridges under a sky that was crowded with more stars than either of them had ever seen from within the walls of a city. Paul stepped out onto the cooling slope of a dune, and his boots sank a little into the fine, pale grains, and he felt for the first time the true size of the world he had been brought to, a world that did not know his name and did not care that he was the son of a duke. The Lady Jessica moved with a stillness that came from long training, and though her heart was heavy with grief for the man she had loved, she allowed none of that heaviness to slow her hands. She and Paul unpacked the small survival stores that had been hidden away for them by a friend who had not lived to see them use his gift, and among those stores they found the folded shelter that the desert people called a stiltent, a clever skin of a tent that could be spread between the dunes and sealed against the burning day, and which would gather back the very moisture of their breathing, so that not a drop of the water within their own bodies would be wasted to the thirsty air. They raised the tent together in the starlight, mother and son working without words, and when it was sealed and the small warmth of their two bodies filled it, they lay down at last in the little pocket of safety they had made. Two people cast out of a whole world and left with only each other and the sand. In the days that followed, they learned the slow patience of the desert. They learned to sleep through the worst heat of the day and to travel in the gentler cool of the dusk and the dawn. And they learned to move without the steady rhythm that might call up from the depths one of the great sandworms whose passing shook the ground like distant thunder. They rationed their water with a care that was almost a kind of prayer, and they gathered what small nourishment they could, and always around them lay the spice, the strange and precious substance of Arrakis, the melange, which drifted in the very dust of that place, and hung faintly in the air they breathed, and touched the food they ate, and settled into the fabric of everything they owned. It was the spice, more than the grief or the danger, that began quietly to change the boy. For the melange of Arrakis was no ordinary thing, and in a mind already shaped by his mother's careful teaching and carrying within it the long inheritance of many secret bloodlines, the concentrated spice of the deep desert began to wake something that had lain sleeping. Paul felt it first as a heightening of the ordinary world, a sense that colors were deeper and that sounds carried further, and that he could feel, almost, the shape of a moment before it arrived. He did not speak of it at once, and he lay in the warm darkness of the stiltent while his mother slept, and he watched the strange new clarity opening within him like a door swinging slowly wide onto a room he had never known was there. And then the visions came. They did not come gently. In the deep hours, with the sand cool and silent all around, Paul saw before him not the small and immediate future of water and shelter, but great sweeping corridors of time that branched and branched again like the roots of some vast and terrible tree. He saw armies. He saw green banners lifted above the fighting men of many worlds, and he saw those men carrying his own name across the gulf between the stars as a war cry. And he saw the fire of that carrying spread from planet to planet in a holy and unstoppable flood. He saw a great war fought in his name, and for his sake, a war that would drink down whole populations, and he understood with a cold and sinking certainty that the boy lying in a tent in the sand was somehow the still point from which all of that ruin might one day pour outward. He did not want it. That was the thing that pressed most heavily upon him in those long desert nights. The knowing that what he saw was not a thing he desired, and yet was a thing that seemed to gather toward him, no matter which turning of the branching paths he studied. He looked for the road that led away from the fire, and again the paths curved back, and the banners rose, and the war spread out among the stars, and he began to understand that he had been set upon a course he had not chosen, and could not easily set down. He was a boy of few years, and he carried within his young mind the weight of futures that would have broken older and harder men, and he held that weight quietly, alone. While his mother slept an arm's length away, the Lady Jessica saw the change in her son, for she was too skilled an observer to miss it, and it filled her with a mixture of wonder and of fear. She had been trained to shape and to guide, and she had given her son teachings that no ordinary boy received, and now she watched those teachings and the spice of this harsh world bring forth in him something that reached beyond anything the sisterhood had planned or foreseen. She reached toward him with tenderness, wanting to be simply his mother in the dark, wanting to shelter him as she had sheltered him when he was small, and yet she felt him drawing already into places where she could not fully follow. And so their bond in those days became a fragile and precious thing, made of the small, ordinary kindnesses of shared water and shared warmth and quiet watchfulness, and made also of the unspoken knowledge that the child between them was becoming something the universe would not leave in peace. Together they waited in the vast and silent sand, two survivors of a murdered house, holding to one another in the little sealed pocket of the Stilton, while the dunes stretched away in every direction beneath the wheeling stars. They did not yet know what shape their survival would take, or whose hands might reach out to them from the emptiness, and they knew only that they must endure and keep their water and keep each other and wait. And out in that endless quiet, unseen as yet by mother or by son, there moved across the deep desert other figures who had learned its every secret, a hidden people who watched from the folds of the land and who had already begun, in their own careful way, to wonder about the two strangers sheltering among their dunes. Up next, in Chapter 8, the Fremen and the hidden Sietch will walk softly into the secret world of the desert people and learn how these quiet watchers of the sand keep their sheltered homes and their treasured water hidden deep within the mountains, and how their gentle first meeting with the two wanderers would begin to change the fate of them all. Chapter 8. The Fremen and the hidden Sietch. In the deep hours before the desert dawn, when the great dunes lay silver and still beneath a sky crowded with more stars than any lowlander could ever hope to count, Paul and his mother Jessica came at last to the end of their long and lonely wandering, and they came into the keeping of the desert people, the Fremen, who moved through the night like shadows given breath and purpose. For many days the boy and his mother had traveled across the open sand, hiding in the folds of the land through the burning hours and walking when the cool of darkness gave them ease. And though they had believed themselves alone in all that vast emptiness, they had never truly been alone at all, for the Fremen had watched them from the rocks with patient and measuring eyes, weighing the strangers as the desert itself weighed all living things, gently and without haste and without mercy, asking only whether they were worthy of the water in their own flesh. The one who led these desert people was called Stilgar, a man of hard and weathered strength, his eyes the deep and total blue of one who had breathed the spice of Arrakis all his days, and in his bearing there lived a quiet dignity that owed nothing to titles or to thrones, but only to the long mastery of survival in a world that wished all soft things dead. He came upon Paul and Jessica among the rocks with his troop gathered close about him, and there in the starlight a testing passed between them, a careful measuring of will and courage, until Stilgar looked upon the boy and upon the mother and saw in them a strength that the desert itself might one day come to honor. And so, rather than leaving them to the sand, he chose to take them into his troop and to lead them home across the trackless waste to the hidden place where his people dwelled. That hidden place was called a Sietch, which in the old tongue of the Fremen meant a place of gathering in a time of danger, and it lay concealed within the living rock of a great mountain that rose from the sea of dunes like the back of some sleeping and ancient beast. From the outside a traveler might pass within a stone's throw of that place and never guess that anything lived there at all, for the Fremen had learned across the long centuries to leave no trace upon the land, to fold themselves into the stone and the shadow so that the desert kept their secret. But within the rock there opened a whole world of gentle warmth and quiet industry, a community of many thousands of souls living together in caverns lit by soft glowing globes, their footsteps hushed, their voices low, their lives ordered by a discipline as old and as unbending as the mountains themselves. For the Fremen lived by the law of water, and water was to them the most precious thing in all the world, more dear than any jewel, more sacred than any coin. For in the deep desert, a single drop might mean the difference between a life continued and a life given back to the sand. Every breath a Fremen took was gathered and returned, for they wore garments called stillsuits that reclaimed the moisture of the body, and the very tears of grief were counted as a gift too precious to be spilled without purpose. When one of their people died, the water of that body was reclaimed with reverence and given back to the tribe, held in trust for the living and for the great slow dream they carried in their hearts, the dream of a green Arrakis, a world one day made gentle with flowing rivers and open pools beneath an untroubled sky. And though that dream lay generations distant, they tended it as a mother tends a sleeping child, patiently, faithfully, across the long turning of the years. Into this hidden life Paul and Jessica were slowly and carefully woven, as a new thread is worked into an old and treasured tapestry, and the people watched them and grew to know them, and a place was made for them within the warmth of the rock. There was need among the Fremen for one who could guide them in the deep mysteries of the spirit, for their old Reverend Mother had grown very near the end of her days and longed to pass her burden on before she went into the sand. And Jessica, who had been trained in the ancient and secret disciplines of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood since her earliest childhood, was called upon to take up that sacred office and to become a Reverend Mother of the tribe. To do this, she was asked to undergo the gravest of trials, the changing of the water of life, which was a bitter and potent essence drawn from the drowning of a small sandworm in the water of the tribe, a substance so powerful that any who took it untrained would surely die. Within her own body, by the deep arts she had mastered, Jessica gathered the poison of that water and transformed it, changing its nature so that it became safe and holy, a thing that could be shared in the great ceremonies of the people. And in that same trembling moment she opened within herself the long inner memory of all the mothers who had come before her, the countless generations whose lives and wisdom now flowed into her keeping, so that she became a vessel of the tribe's whole past. Yet Jessica carried within her also the unborn child of the fallen Duke, and that little one shared in the changing of the water, awakened far too soon to knowledge no infant should hold, a matter that would ripple gently forward into the years still to come. For Paul the desert had a different gift, and that gift was a new life and new names to carry it. The Fremen, having taken him into their hearts, gave him a place among them as one of their own, and by their custom, a man chose for himself a secret name known only to the deepest fellowship, a name he might cry out to the desert in his hour of greatest need. And Paul chose for that secret name Usul, which meant the strength of the base of the pillar, the firm and quiet root upon which all else might safely stand. But the people asked also for a name to speak aloud, a name for the manhood he was growing into among them, and Paul looked to the small desert mouse that thrived where nothing else could live, the little creature the Fremen called Muad'Dib, whose shape they saw traced in the shadows of the second moon, and he took that name for his own. And so the boy who had come to them a hunted stranger became Paul Muad'Dib, and the desert began to fold his name into its songs. Among the people of the Sietch there was a young woman named Chani, slender and quick and fierce, with the great blue eyes of her people and a spirit as bright and untamed as the desert wind, and she was the daughter of the planetologist Liet, a figure of quiet reverence among the Fremen. From their first meeting, something gentle and enduring kindled between Paul and Chani, a warmth that grew slowly and surely as the seasons turned within the rock, until she became to him a companion of the heart, a light in the long nights of the desert, and the love they shared wove itself into the deepening story of his days. Beside her he learned the countless ways of the Fremen, the walking without rhythm that kept the great worms from rising, the tending of the stills and the traps, the songs and the silences, the whole intricate grace of a people who had made a home in the harshest place beneath the stars. And so, drop by patient drop, as water gathers in the hidden cisterns of the deep rock, Paul was woven into the life and the legends of the desert people, no longer a lord of some distant world, but a son of the sand, carried gently in the arms of a hardy and faithful folk who had begun, in their quiet and watchful way, to wonder whether the old prophecies of a voice from the outer worlds might at last be coming true. The Sietch held him warm within its stone, and the long desert night wrapped itself softly around all their sleeping. And for a little while, there was peace. Up next in Chapter 9, Paul's Visions and the Water of Life, we'll drift deeper still into the strange dreaming that stirred within the young Muad'Dib, and follow the slow, gentle unfolding of the sight that reached across time, as the spice of Arrakis and the sacred water opened doorways in his mind that no other had ever passed through. And we will rest there together in the hush of what was still to come. Chapter 9. Paul's Visions and the Water of Life. In the deep hours of the Sietch, when the great cavern lay hushed beneath its ceiling of ancient stone, and the wind of Arrakis moved across the dunes far above like a slow and endless breathing, Paul Atreides lay awake within the folds of his chamber and felt the desert changing him. He had lived now for a long season among the Fremen, wrapped each day in the still suit that gathered the moisture of his own body, eating the food of the sietch and drinking the water of the tribe, and in all of that food and all of that water there lived the spice, the melange of Arrakis, breathed into the air and folded into the meals and steeped into the very taste of the caverns. The spice was in him now, threaded through his blood and settled into the quiet places of his mind, and it had begun to open doors that no ordinary human had ever been meant to pass through. He had known glimmers of the future, even as a boy on Caladan, small flickers that came in dreams and were gone by morning, but here in the great southern deserts the flickers had grown into something vast and terrible and beautiful all at once. When he closed his eyes, he no longer saw only darkness. He saw time itself, spread before his inner sight like a landscape without end, a country of hills and valleys where the past lay behind him fixed and unmoving, and the future rose ahead in 1,000 branching paths. He saw the moments that had already been, the death of his father the Duke, the burning of Arrakeen, the long walk into the sand, and he saw them not as memory alone, but as living things that pressed against the present. And beyond the present he saw the countless futures, each one a road that split and split again. Some roads bright and some roads dark, some ending in ash and some winding on into years he could not yet name. This was the gift the spice had wakened in him, and it was also a burden heavier than any he had carried. For a mind that can see so many roads must learn which roads are near and which are far, must learn to walk among the branching paths without becoming lost in them, and Paul was still learning. Sometimes the visions came like a flood, and he would surface from them trembling, uncertain for a moment whether the thing he had just seen had already happened or was yet to come. The Fremen watched him in these hours with a quiet reverence, for their old legends spoke of one who would come to them with such sight, a voice from the outer world who would see with the eyes of the deep desert, and they wondered among themselves whether this young man from the green planets might be the one the legends promised. There lived in the sietch an old woman of great power, a reverend mother of the Fremen, keeper of the tribe's memory and mistress of a mystery older than any of them could reckon. She held within her the lives of all the reverend mothers who had gone before her, an unbroken chain of women reaching back and back into the distant past, each one passing her memories forward at the hour of her death so that none of the tribe's wisdom would ever truly be lost. And the means by which this passing was accomplished, the sacred substance at the heart of the Fremen mystery, was the thing they called the water of life. The water of life was a poison. It was the bile of a young sandworm, drawn from the creature at the moment it was drowned in water, for water was death to the great worms of Arrakis, and in its drowning the small worm gave up a liquid so deadly that a single drink of it unchanged would kill an ordinary person outright. Yet the Reverend Mother could take this poison into her own body and, by a mastery learned in the deepest training of her order, transmute it within herself, changing its nature so that what had been death became instead an awakening. When she had changed the poison, she would share it with the tribe, and the people would drink of the changed water and fall together into a great communion, a spice trance in which the walls between them grew thin and the whole sietch became for a time a single joined awareness. In this way the Fremen renewed themselves, and in this way the Reverend Mother passed her burden to the daughter who would follow her. But there was a thing that no Reverend Mother had ever been able to do, and it was spoken of only in hushed tones, as a hope and a fear at once. Within each Reverend Mother there lay a place she could not look upon, a darkness in her inner sight that she could reach toward, but never enter. The women of the sisterhood that had bred and guided the bloodlines of the great houses for uncounted generations had long sought to bring forth a single one, a male who could bear the memories of both the mothers and the fathers, who could look into that forbidden darkness and see. They had a name for this one they sought. They called him the Kwisatz Haderach, a phrase from an old and secret tongue meaning the shortening of the way, the one who could be many places at once, the bridge across the place that no other mind could cross. And Paul, lying in the sietch with the spice singing in his blood and the futures branching endlessly before him, came at last to understand that the road he most needed to see led straight through that forbidden darkness. His visions, for all their vastness, broke against a wall he could not pass, and beyond that wall lay the answers he most desperately sought. He came to know, with the slow certainty that settles over a person in the quiet before a great decision, that only one thing could carry him past the wall. He would have to drink the water of life. He would have to take the unchanged poison into himself, the deadly bile that no man had ever survived, and trust that whatever the sisterhood had bred into his blood across the long centuries would carry him through the darkness rather than leave him dead upon the cavern floor. So, he drank. He took the unchanged water into his body, and the poison struck him like a great wave breaking over stone, and he fell. He fell out of the waking world entirely, down and down into a stillness so deep that his breathing slowed almost to nothing, and his heart beat only faintly beneath his ribs. For weeks he lay as one dead, and the tribe kept watch over him, and the young Fremen woman, who had come to love him, watched longest of all, tending his still form and waiting for a sign. His body lay unmoving in the chamber, but his mind had gone traveling in the dark country beyond the wall, walking the very roads no reverend mother had ever walked, seeing at last into the place that had been closed to all who came before him. And when he woke, he was changed. He rose from the long coma with the poison transmuted within him, mastered and turned, and he knew himself now for what the sisterhood had sought across all those patient generations. He was the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could look where no other could look, whose sight reached backward through all the fathers and all the mothers, and forward across the branching futures with a clarity none had ever held. The wall was gone, and in its place lay a terrible openness. For in that clearer sight he saw more plainly than ever the thing that his own rising would set loose upon the universe. He saw the fervor gathering in the hearts of the desert people, saw his name carried out beyond Arrakis on the winds of belief, and saw the great and bloody storm that would follow, a holy war spreading across the stars in his name, carrying his banner into worlds beyond counting. He saw it, and he understood that the path forward and the path he most wished to avoid were bound together in ways he could not easily untangle, and he carried that knowledge quietly within him as the sietch woke around him and welcomed their sleeper back into the light. Up next, in Chapter 10, Muad'Dib, prophet of the Fremen, we'll rest a while longer in the warm hush of the sietch and follow the way a wandering young man became a name whispered with awe across the dunes, and the gentle turning by which the Fremen came to see in him the fulfillment of all their oldest and dearest hopes. When Paul rose at last from the deep stillness of the water of life, changed in ways that neither he nor his mother could fully measure, the Fremen who watched over him understood that something long promised had at last come to pass among them. For weeks he had lain as one dead within the sietch, his flesh cool and his breath so faint that only the sharpest eyes could see it, and Chani had kept the moisture of his body from being lost, and the old ones had waited in the shadows, watching. And when he wakened and spoke softly of the things he had seen, of the past that lay coiled within his blood and the futures that spread before him like the branching of a great desert plant, the people knew that the one they had awaited across the long generations had come to walk among them in the flesh. There was in the deep memory of the Fremen a name they had carried for centuries, the name of the Lisan al-Ghib, which in their old tongue meant the voice from the outer world, a savior who would be born of a Bene Gesserit mother and who would lead them at last out of their bondage and into a green and gentle paradise. This hope had not risen by chance among them, for long ago the quiet sisterhood had come to Arrakis and had sown the seeds of legend into the beliefs of the desert folk, a working they called the Missionaria Protectiva, which planted such prophecies upon wild and dangerous worlds so that a sister who came after, in some hour of need, might find shelter within a faith already prepared for her. And so, in a way that was both true and strange, Paul stepped into a role that had been shaped and waiting for centuries before his birth, a garment cut long ago, to a measure he now filled. And the Fremen looked upon him and saw the fulfillment of everything their grandmothers had whispered. Among the Fremen he took a new name, as was their custom, and he chose it with care from the small and quiet creatures of the desert that he had come to love. He named himself Muad'Dib, after the little mouse that lived upon the open sand, the desert mouse whose shape the Fremen saw traced in the second moon. A creature wise in the ways of survival, who knew how to gather the dew and to hide from the terrible heat and to live where nothing else could live. And this name pleased the people greatly, for it was humble and yet it was strong. And it bound their savior to the land itself, so that when they spoke of Muad'Dib, they spoke of one who belonged wholly to Arrakis, born again out of its sand and its silence. He kept also his other Fremen name Usul, which meant the strength of the base of the pillar, a secret name for the closeness of the troop, spoken softly among those who loved him best. Yet before the people could follow him wholly, there was one great trial he had still to pass, a rite that every Fremen man must undergo before he could be counted truly among them. And this was the riding of the Great Maker, the sandworm itself. For the Fremen did not merely fear the vast worms that moved beneath the dunes. They had learned across the long ages to master them, to call one up out of the deep sand with the rhythmic drumming of a device they named a thumper, and then to run beside its titanic length, and to fix their hooks, the maker hooks, into the leading edge of one of its great ringed segments. By holding that ring open to the abrasive sand, the rider forced the worm to roll its tender inner flesh upward, away from the hurt, and so to rise toward the surface and to travel where its rider wished, carrying a whole band of Fremen swiftly across distances that would take many nights to cross on foot. When the day came for Paul to make his own worm ride, he went out upon the open sand in the sight of the tribe, and he planted his hooks in one of the greatest makers any of them had seen in long memory, a worm so vast that its coming shook the ground like the passing of a storm. And he mounted it and rode it as though he had been born to the task, and he brought it far across the desert and back again. And when he stepped down from it at last, the people raised their voices in a great and joyful sound, for now there could be no doubt at all. He was Fremen in full, a rider of makers, and he was also their prophet, and the two truths together made of him something the desert had never before held. From that mastery there grew swiftly a thing that neither the emperor nor the great houses had foreseen. For Paul began to gather the scattered tribes of the deep desert into a single purpose, and to forge of them a weapon such as the Imperium had never faced. The Fremen were fighters beyond any other, hardened by a world that killed the weak, disciplined and fearless and utterly at home in the wastes that no outsider could survive, and under Muad'Dib they turned their skill against the harvesters of the spice. In the long nights his fighting bands struck at the crawlers and the carryalls and the guarded outposts, taking the melange and slipping back into the trackless dunes before any force could answer. And slowly the mighty flow of spice from Arrakis began to falter and to thin, and the great powers who fed upon that flow grew afraid. And all the while, the legend of him spread across the planet like water sinking into thirsty sand, passing from siyach to siyach, and from mouth to quiet mouth, until there was scarcely a Fremen anywhere who did not speak his name with reverence. They told of the boy who had ridden the greatest of makers, of the off-worlder who had become more Fremen than the Fremen, of the one who had drunk the water of life and lived, of the prophet whose sight reached into times not yet born. A vast army gathered slowly around him in the deep desert, legions of hardened warriors who counted their lives as nothing beside his cause, and their numbers and their devotion grew into a power that could shake the throne of a Padishah emperor and topple the order of 10,000 worlds. Yet within Paul himself, beneath the calm surface that the people saw, there ran a deep and troubled current that he could share with almost no one. He had come to love the clean, hard life of the desert, the closeness of the tribe, the plain honesty of the siyach, the quiet nights beside Chani and the child that would come, and a part of him wished only to remain there always, a Fremen among the Fremen. No more than that. But the terrible gift of his prescience showed him another thing rushing toward him out of the days ahead. A great and bloody unleashing of these very legions across the stars. A holy war carried in his name to worlds beyond counting. A river of green banners and fervent death that he could feel gathering behind him like a wave that has already begun to fall. He saw it, and he grieved for it, and he sought in every path his vision offered some way to turn it aside. And always the wave was there, and this was the sorrow he carried hidden beneath the love the people gave him. Up next, in Chapter 11, the duel with the Emperor and the throne, we'll drift softly toward the great gathering of powers upon the sands of Arrakis, where the Padishah Emperor himself came down at last with his dreaded legions, and where all the long threads of prophecy and vengeance and desert strength would be drawn together into a single quiet hour of reckoning. So let yourself grow calm and easy now, and rest. Chapter 11. The duel with the Emperor and the throne in the long, quiet unfolding of the desert seasons, after Paul Atreides had become Muad'Dib and the Fremen had come to look upon him as their prophet and their sword, there arrived upon the sands of Arrakis the one man whose coming had been foreseen for many years. The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, ruler of 1,000,000 worlds, master of House Carino, whose family had held the Golden Lion throne for longer than anyone living could rightly remember. He came down from the black gulf of space with a great gathering of ships, and within those ships rode his terrible legions of Sardaukar, the soldier fanatics of the imperial prison planet Seleucia Secundus, whose discipline and ferocity had long been the quiet secret behind the throne, and alongside them came the full strength of House Harkonnen, gathered under the swollen shape of the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who still believed, in the deep folds of his scheming, that Arrakis and its spice belonged to him. The Emperor sat down upon the plain before the great city of Arrakeen, and there he raised his enormous metal tent, a hall of grouped hutment so vast that it could hold thousands, and within it he gathered his court, his advisors, his Sardaukar commanders, and the noble hostages who traveled always with him. Among that company was the Emperor's eldest daughter, the Princess Irulan, a young woman of learning and quiet observation, trained in the ways of the Bene Gesserit, who watched all that passed with a careful and thoughtful eye, and who would one day set down in her own hand the histories that generations would read. The emperor had come because the spice flow had faltered, and rebellion had risen in the deep desert, and he meant to crush the trouble at its root, never truly understanding that the trouble had a name, and that the name was Muad'Dib. Far out beyond the walls of the city, sheltered in the folds of the mountains and the hidden caverns of the deep desert, Paul Atreides looked upon the emperor's coming with the strange doubled sight that the spice had opened within him, seeing not one future, but many, and choosing his path along the narrow thread that led toward victory. He had gathered to himself the Fremen tribes, tens of thousands of hardened desert warriors who moved across the dunes like the wind itself, and he had ridden the great sandworms, the makers, the vast leviathans of Arrakis, and had bent even them to the purpose of this hour. A storm was rising in the wide desert, one of the tremendous father storms of Arrakis, a wall of driven sand moving with a force that could strip flesh from bone and scour steel to nothing, and Paul had waited for it with the patience of a man who has already seen the shape of what will come. When the storm reached its full and howling strength, Paul gave the sign, and the Fremen brought forth the family atomics, the ancient nuclear stockpile of House Atreides, which had been carried in secret across the desert and hidden against this single need. These weapons were not turned against people, for that was forbidden by the oldest laws of the Great Convention, but were instead aimed at the shield wall, the towering barrier of rock that stood between the desert and the city, and that had always sheltered Arrakeen from the worst of the storms. The atomics spoke with a light brighter than the sun, and the shield wall was broken open, a great gap torn through the ancient stone, and through that gap the storm came roaring, and through that gap came Muad'Dib and all his Fremen host. The imperial shields, which had always protected the Sardaukar and the Harkonnen soldiers, failed and flickered in the fury of the sandstorm, for such shields could not stand against the driven grit of Arrakis, and so the finest soldiers in the known universe found themselves stripped of their advantage in the space of a single terrible morning. And then came the worms. Out of the desert they rose, the great makers, mouths wide as caverns, and upon their backs and among their coils rode the Fremen with their long hooks and their maker spears, and the earth itself seemed to turn against the emperor's army. The Sardaukar, who had never in living memory been broken in open battle, were swept aside and scattered and overwhelmed, and the Harkonnen forces crumbled with them, and the great charge carried Muad'Dib and his people straight through the ruin of the plain and into the very hall of the emperor himself. So it was that the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, master of 1,000,000 worlds, was taken captive within his own metal hall, and his court with him, and the proud Sardaukar laid down before the desert people they had come to punish. Into that hall Paul Atreides walked as a conqueror, and yet he came not with wild fury, but with a strange calm, for he held in his hand a weapon greater than any army. He had learned the deepest secret of the spice, that the melange upon which the whole empire depended, the spice that let the guild navigators fold space and guide the great ships between the stars, existed nowhere in all the universe save upon Arrakis alone. And so Paul made his quiet threat that if he were denied, he would loose upon the desert a thing that would destroy the spice utterly and forever, ending its creation for all time. Such a thing would blind the guild, would halt every ship, would freeze all travel between the worlds, and would shatter the empire into 10,000 isolated fragments. In that single promise lay a power that no throne could answer. For the man who could destroy the spice held the whole of civilization gently in the palm of his hand. Yet before the throne could pass to him fully, there remained an ancient matter of honor. For the Harkonnens had wronged House Atreides beyond all counting, and by the old law of the challenge one of that blood stood forward. It was Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, the young nephew of the Baron, groomed and sharpened as a weapon of his house, who took up the ritual duel against Paul, and the two met blade to blade upon the floor of that great hall while the Emperor and all his court looked on. Feyd-Rautha was cunning and swift, and carried hidden treacheries about him. A poisoned needle concealed against the moment of Paul's mercy. But Muad'Dib had walked this path in his visions, and knew the shape of every deceit. The blades moved, and the two circled, and in the end it was Paul Atreides who stood, and Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen who fell, and the last knife of that ancient enmity was drawn, and set to rest upon the sands of Arrakis. With the duel ended and the throne undefended, Paul Atreides claimed the empire as his own, and the Padishah Emperor, having no army left to lift and no spice left to bargain with, gave over the Golden Lion throne to the young Duke of the Desert. To bind the change in a way that all the great houses of the Landsraad would honor, Paul took the Princess Irulan to be his wife, and by that marriage he made himself the lawful heir to House Corrino and the rightful holder of the throne. Yet it was a marriage of name and of statecraft only, a bond of politics and legitimacy. For Paul's true heart belonged, as it had long belonged, to Chani, the fierce and gentle Fremen woman who had walked the desert at his side through all the hidden years. And it was Chani whom he loved, and Chani who remained his beloved, though Irulan would wear the title of princess consort and would write the histories of the age. And so, in the space of one storm and one duel, the boy who had fled into the desert became the master of the known universe, and the desert people looked upon their Muad'Dib and knew that the world had turned. Up next in Chapter 12, the jihad Paul could not stop, we'll drift softly into the strange and sorrowful aftermath of the throne and see how the great wave of holy war rose from the sands in Muad'Dib's name. A tide he had glimpsed in his visions long before, and yet could never quite hold back, carrying his green banner out across the stars while he watched, quiet and weary. From the high and lonely seat of empire. Chapter 12. The jihad Paul could not stop. The throne that Paul Atreides had claimed upon the sands of Arrakis was a thing of stone and dust and old imperial gold, and yet as he sat upon it in the quiet after the great battle, he understood with a slow and sinking certainty that it was not truly a seat of rest at all. It was the top of a wave, and a wave does not stop moving simply because a man has climbed onto its crest. He had reached the summit of everything the desert prophecy had promised, and there, at that highest of all the places he had ever stood, he found waiting for him the one shadow he had spent his whole young life trying to outrun. In the long silence of his victory, when the guns had gone still and the banners hung limp in the windless heat, the thing he had most dreaded did not retreat before his crown. It came closer, patient and enormous, like a tide that has decided at last to come in. For years his prescient vision had shown him many futures, branching and folding like the countless dunes of the deep desert, and among all those possible tomorrows, one image had returned again and again with a terrible constancy. It was the vision of a galaxy set aflame in his name, a holy war carried outward from Arrakis by the fervor of the very people who now knelt to him and loved him. The Fremen who had sheltered him, who had taught him the ways of water and silence and survival, who had given him a desert name and a place among their sietches, these same devoted people carried within their faith a seed that had been planted long before his arrival. The seed was the belief in one who would come, and now, in their eyes, he had come. Their loyalty was not a small or gentle thing. It was a deep well of longing many centuries old, and he had bent down and drunk from it in order to win. And now the well would not be capped again. This was the great and quiet irony that lay coiled at the very heart of his triumph. Every step he had taken to save his mother and himself, every alliance he had made in the caves, every miracle the tribes had witnessed and passed from mouth to mouth around their nighttime fires, had gathered the fervor tighter and tighter until it had grown into a force with a will and a momentum entirely its own. He had ridden that religious devotion the way a man might ride a great sandworm across the open bled, guiding it, using its strength, feeling its power carry him toward the throne. Yet a worm of that size is not truly steered by the one who rides it. It is merely permitted, for a time, to be ridden. And Paul understood now, with the whole of his awakened sight, that the beast beneath him was far larger and far older than any single life, and that it had chosen its own direction long before he had learned to cling to its back. He searched. This was perhaps the hardest thing for him to bear, and the saddest, that he searched so carefully and found nothing. With his inner vision, he walked down every corridor of the future that he could reach, patient and desperate, hunting for the single narrow path along which the war would not come. He looked for a word he might say, a person he might spare, a gesture of peace he might offer, a small kindness, or a great renunciation that would let the fervor settle quietly back into the sand. He looked for the version of tomorrow in which he stepped down, or stepped aside, or simply vanished, and the fire went out on its own. In vision after vision he tested these paths the way a swimmer tests deep water, and in vision after vision the same answer came back to him. Even his own death, he saw, would not still it. Slain, he would become a martyr. And a martyr is a banner that never tires, and the legions would march the harder for his absence, carrying his memory like a torch into the dark between the stars. So it was that the young man upon the ancient throne came to know himself as something he had never wished to be. He had become a sail, and around him a storm was rising, and the storm was made of his own myth. A sail cannot command the wind. It can only be filled or torn. And either way, the wind does what the wind has always meant to do. He had wanted to be the master of his fate, the careful architect of a better and kinder future for his house and for the people he had come to love. Instead, he found himself held aloft by a power that wore his face and spoke his name, and yet did not, in the end, belong to him at all. The prophecy he had used had turned in his hands and taken hold of him, and now it would use him just as surely as he had once thought to use it. Around him, the machinery of the holy war had already begun to turn, slow at first, the way the greatest and heaviest things always begin to move. In the sietches of the deep desert, the word was passing from tribe to tribe that the promised one had risen, that the long night of waiting was over, that the time to carry the faith outward had finally arrived. The green banners were being readied. The young men were sharpening their resolve and lifting their eyes toward the stars that had for so long been closed to them. What had been for generations a private and inward hope, whispered in the safety of the caverns, was becoming an outward and unstoppable purpose. The fervor that Paul had ridden to power was gathering itself now into a great crusade. And that crusade was preparing to spill across the whole of the known universe, from Arrakis outward to worlds whose names the desert people had never before spoken aloud. He grieved for it. There was no other honest word for what he felt. seated in his hard-won stillness, while the future assembled itself beyond the walls. He grieved the way a man grieves for something already lost that has not yet finished happening. He knew the count of the worlds that would be touched, and the weight of it lay upon him like the whole desert pressed into a single quiet ache within his chest. He carried the knowledge of it alone, for who among the joyful and the faithful could have understood that their beloved and their prophet looked out upon their coming glory and saw only a sorrow too vast to name? He had won everything, and in winning it he had learned that some victories arrive already carrying their own long shadow, and that a man may sit upon the highest throne in all creation and still be, in the deepest and truest part of himself, a prisoner of the very love that raised him there. And so the wave began, at last, to break. Slowly, gently at its first stirring, and then with a growing and irreversible motion, the fervor of the desert rose from the sands of Arrakis and reached toward the endless dark, carrying with it the name of a young man who would have given a great deal to call it back, and could not. The storm had his face upon its banners, and the sail was full, and the wind blew on toward horizons no single will could close. Up next, in Chapter 13, 12 years of holy war, we'll drift softly across those long and distant years, following the green banners as they moved among the stars, and resting a while with the quiet, sorrowing man at the center of it all, who watched his own legend travel farther than he had ever meant it to go. Chapter 13, 12 years of holy war. When the jihad first spilled outward from Arrakis, it moved the way a rising tide moves across a shallow shore, slowly at first, and then with a weight that could not be turned back. And in the long, quiet years that followed, the whole of the known universe learned the name of Paul Muad'Dib and learned to bow before it. Nearly 12 years passed in this way, 12 years measured not in the gentle turning of ordinary seasons, but in the falling of worlds. And across all that time the green banner of the Atreides was carried from planet to planet by the desert legions of the Fremen, who had come out of the sand to remake the shape of human power. To lie still and consider those years is to consider a thing almost too vast to hold in a single evening of thought, and so it is best to let the mind drift over them slowly, the way one drifts over the memory of a long road already traveled. Paul now sat upon the throne of the known universe as its emperor, ruling from Arrakis, from the desert world that had once tried so hard to kill him and had instead given him everything. And the very planet that men had once called nothing more than a wasteland of dust became the still center around which all of humankind turned. From there the spice flowed as it had always flowed, and whoever held the spice held the whole of civilization in the palm of one hand, for without the melange there could be no navigators to fold space, no travel between the stars, no thread to bind the scattered worlds together. Paul held that thread, and because he held it, the old powers that had ruled before him, the great noble houses and the trading combine, and the reverend mothers of the sisterhood, all of them found themselves bending at last to the will of the one man they had never truly understood. Around his name there had grown a religion, and it was a religion of enormous reach, an ocean of faith that covered every inhabited world and left almost nothing untouched by its tide. A vast priesthood arose to tend that faith, an order of holy functionaries called the Chizarate, and its priests, the Chizara, carried the worship of Muad'Dib into every city and every distant settlement, teaching the doctrine, keeping the rites, gathering the tithes, and speaking always of the emperor as something more than a man. What had begun as the private hope of a hunted people had become the official creed of a government that spanned the stars. And the machinery of that government was woven so tightly into the machinery of the faith, that no one could any longer say where the one ended and the other began. To govern in Paul's name and to worship in Paul's name became the very same act, and the priests who administered the one administered the other with the same steady hands. Out beyond the ordered heart of the empire, at the ragged edges where the writ of the throne was still being written, the legions of the Fremen went on with their long work of conquest, world after world after world, falling before them across the passing of the 12 years. These were not soft soldiers born to easy lives. They were the sons and daughters of the deep desert, hardened by a world that had asked everything of them. And they fought with a devotion that no ordinary army could match, for they fought not for pay and not for land, but for their living God. Planet by planet they brought the reluctant and the defiant into submission. And where worlds would not yield, worlds were broken, and the cost of all this was a number so great that the mind can scarcely bend itself around it. For the holy war was said to have consumed many billions of lives across its long unfolding. 61 billion. Some of the reckonings would later whisper, 61 billion who did not live to see the peace that was made in their absence, and even to speak the figure softly in the dark is to feel the weight of it settle over the heart. In the doing of all this, the Fremen themselves were changed, and the change was as great as any conquest they carried out. Once they had been a hidden and humble people, poor in everything but courage and water discipline, living in the sietches beneath the open sky and hoarding each drop of moisture as though it were the whole of their wealth. Now they were the masters of the universe, the sword and the shield of an emperor, given wealth and station and power beyond anything their grandparents could have dreamed in the driest of their dreams. The rough desert folk who had once slipped like shadows between the dunes now walked as lords through the halls of conquered worlds, and the Sietch pit and the still tent gave way slowly to the palace and the temple, and something of the old hard purity was traded, quietly and without anyone quite choosing it, for the softer burdens of empire. And at the heart of all this vast and turning machinery sat Paul himself, and he was, in a way that grew heavier with each of the 12 years, alone. He had become a god in the eyes of countless billions, a living god whose smallest word could raise a temple or level a city. And yet the very godhood that had been built up around him had become a kind of prison. Its walls made of faith rather than stone, but no less real for that. He was trapped inside the religion that carried his name, held fast by the reverence of the people who loved him. For a god may not step down from his altar, and a god may not be doubted, and a god may not simply be a man among other men. Every gesture he made was read as scripture, every silence taken for wisdom, and the more they worshipped him, the further they placed him from the ordinary warmth of being one person among the many. There was a weariness in him that the empire could not see, a deep and gentle tiredness that came from being adored by multitudes and truly known by almost none. To be worshipped, he learned, is not the same as to be understood, and the endless tide of prayer that rose toward him from 1,000 worlds gave him no companion and eased no loneliness, for one cannot lean upon the ones who kneel. He had foreseen much of this in the terrible visions of his prescience, had walked ahead in his own mind down the corridors of the years, and watched the holy war spill its rivers of death across the stars. And knowing did not spare him, for to see a thing coming and to be unable to turn it aside is its own quiet sorrow. He carried that knowledge as a man carries a stone he may never set down, and he ruled on, and the faith rose on, and the legions marched on, and the great slow turning of the years went forward toward whatever waited at their end. So the empire settled into an uneasy peace after the long storm of conquest. An empire of worship and priesthood and desert power, resting upon its billions of dead and upon the shoulders of one weary man who had been named a god. And in the deep stillness of these 12 years, there were quiet questions that had not yet been answered. Questions of the heart and of the future, and of who might one day follow where Muad'Dib had walked. Up next in Chapter 14, Chani, Irulan, and the question of an heir, we'll drift gently into the private world behind the throne, where two very different women stand near the emperor, and where the hope for a child to come carries a weight as heavy as any empire. Chapter 14, Chani, Irulan, and the question of an heir far away from the roar of the holy war. In the still heart of the citadel that rose above the city of Arrakis, there was a quieter kind of story unfolding. A story made not of legions and burning worlds, but of two women and one man, and of the longing that moved gently between them like water beneath the sand. For while the armies of the Atreides emperor carried his green and black banner across the folded reaches of the galaxy, the true weight of his days was carried in the small rooms of his own house, in the tenderness and the sorrow that lived there, in the question that no sword could answer and no legion could win. That question, soft and patient and endless, was the question of an heir, of a child who might one day carry the blood of two ancient lines and hold the great and fragile empire together long after Paul himself had passed into memory. Chani was her name, the daughter of the desert, the daughter of the planetologist Liet Kynes, and of a Fremen woman of the Sietch, and she had come to Paul long before the throne, in the years when he was only a boy hunted across the dunes with his mother at his side. She had been his teacher in the ways of the desert and his companion in the long nights beneath the stars, and she had become, in the fullness of time, the wife of his heart, the one his soul had chosen freely and without calculation. The Fremen knew her as Sihaya, which in their old tongue meant the desert spring, the season of gentleness when the harshness of the world softened for a little while, and she was to Paul exactly that, a coolness in the heat of his terrible visions, a place of rest for a man who could see too far and too much. Yet in the eyes of the wider empire, in the long halls where the noble houses gathered and the old traditions held their weight, Chani was not counted as the emperor's wife at all. That title, hollow and cold as a crown of stone, belonged instead to another, to the Princess Irulan, eldest daughter of the fallen Padishah Emperor Shaddam, the fourth of House Carino. When Paul had won his throne upon the sands of Arrakis, he had taken Irulan not out of love and not out of desire, but out of the careful arithmetic of power. For through her the old imperial line passed into his keeping, and through her his rule wore the appearance of lawful succession rather than mere conquest. He had said to her plainly, in the presence of them all, that she would share his name and his titles and his history, that she would be written down beside him in the chronicles of the age, but that she would never share his tenderness, never share his moments of quiet, never be permitted the deep and simple closeness that he reserved for Chani alone. And so Irulan lived within the citadel as a wife in name and a stranger in truth. Honored before the court, and yet utterly alone, a princess who possessed the whole shape of a marriage and none of its warmth. It was a sorrowful arrangement, and it grew more sorrowful still with the passing of the years, for the empire that Paul had built with fire and prophecy needed above all things a continuation, a child born of his blood who could inherit the vast and trembling structure of his rule. The great houses watched and waited, and the priesthood that had risen around his name watched and waited. And everywhere across the settled worlds there lived a quiet and constant hunger for the announcement that never came, the announcement of an heir. Chani felt this hunger more keenly than anyone, for she loved Paul with the whole of her patient heart, and she wished more than she wished for anything in all the folded universe to give him a son or a daughter, to place in his arms a small warm proof that something gentle and living could grow out of all the sorrow he carried. She had borne him one child already in the early years, a boy named Leto after his grandfather. But that little one had been slain in the violence of the conquest, and the grief of that loss lived always beneath her calm, a soft and buried ache that never entirely faded. What Chani did not know, in those long, quiet seasons of waiting and hoping, was that her own body had been turned against her wish by a hidden hand. For the Princess Irulan, denied the love of her husband and yet bound to him by law, had conceived a design of her own, a slow and secret plan spun from patience and desperation together. Trained in the subtle arts of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, schooled in the knowledge of poisons and medicines and the delicate chemistries of the body, Irulan had begun to place among Chani's food a careful measure of contraceptive drugs, so quietly and so cleverly that no watcher ever saw the hand that moved. Her reasoning was cold and sorrowful all at once, for she believed that if Chani could not conceive, then in time Paul might turn to her, to Irulan, the wife of title and of law, and that she herself might bear the imperial heir, and so bind together in a single child the two greatest bloodlines of the age. It was not cruelty that moved her, or not only cruelty, but a lonely and aching longing to matter, to be more than a name written beside another name, to have at last some true place in the house that had taken her in and left her out in the cold. Behind Irulan's quiet scheming there stood another interest, older and vaster, and more patient than any single woman's heart, and that was the interest of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood itself. For long centuries the sisters had guided the marriages of the noble houses along a hidden path, breeding line into line across the generations, in pursuit of a being they called the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could bridge space and time and see where even their own sight failed. Paul was that being, arrived a generation earlier than they had planned and utterly beyond their control, and the child of his blood was to them a prize almost beyond reckoning, a thread they longed above all to gather back into their weaving. Irulan was their daughter and their instrument, and though her loneliness was her own, the great slow purpose behind her actions belonged to the sisterhood that had shaped her, watching from far away with the endless patience of those who counted their plans in centuries rather than years. And beneath all of this, beneath the scheming and the politics and the vast designs of the sisterhood, there remained the simple and abiding love of Paul and Chani, tender and sorrowful and real. In the deep of the night, when the visions receded and the weight of the throne loosened for a little while, he would hold her close and speak to her not as an emperor, but as the boy she had known upon the dunes, and she would ease him as no drug or prophecy ever could. He grieved that he could not give her the honor of a wife's name, and she grieved that she could not give him the child they both so quietly longed for, and yet between them there was no bitterness, only a gentle and enduring devotion that asked nothing and forgave everything. Chani would say, in the softness of her thought, that she was his true wife, whatever the chronicles might record, and Paul held that truth as the one certain and unclouded thing in all the vast and terrible country of his sight, a small warm light burning steadily in the darkness of the empire he had made. Up next in Chapter 15, Aliyah and the Burden of the Abomination. We'll drift gently to Paul's strange and gifted sister, born already awakened with the memories of 1,000 lives before her, a child in years and an ancient in soul, and will follow softly the lonely path she walked between the wisdom of the dead and the innocence she was never allowed to keep. Chapter 15. Aliyah and the Burden of the Abomination in the quiet after the wedding and the courtship of two very different women, when Chani kept the true chamber of Paul's heart and Irulan kept only the hollow crown of his name, there remained one figure who moved through the corridors of the citadel at Arrakis unlike any other soul in all the known worlds, and she was small. And she was a child in body, and she was older in mind than any grandmother who had ever lived, and her name was Aliyah Atreides, the sister of the Emperor, born on the desert planet in the years of blood and prophecy. And to understand her is to understand the strangest and most tender secret that the House of Atreides carried into its long dominion. To speak gently of how Aliyah came to be, one must return in memory to the Sietch of the Fremen. In the days when Paul and his mother Jessica had fled into the deep desert after the fall of their house. And there, among the hidden people of the sand, the Lady Jessica was chosen to become a reverend mother, for the old woman who had held that sacred office was dying, and the tribe could not be without one who kept the memory of all the mothers who had come before. To take up that burden, Jessica was made to drink the water of life, which is the drowned breath of a sandworm changed within the body, a poison so terrible that only a Bene Gesserit trained through long years could turn it inside herself and make of it an awakening rather than a death. And Jessica did this, and she lived. And in the drinking she opened the great inner door through which the lives of countless ancestors came pouring, generation upon generation, mother behind mother, stretching back into the dim beginnings of the human story. Yet Jessica was not alone when she drank. She was heavy with child, carrying a daughter in her womb, and the unborn girl, having no walls of her own, no training, no guarded gates, received all of it at once, the flood of other memory, the tide of ancestral voices, the full and finished consciousness of every life that had ever fed into the line. And so the infant who would be called Aliyah was awakened before she was born, awakened in the warm dark of her mother's body, thinking already the thoughts of an adult, remembering already the memories of the dead, so that when at last she came into the world with a newborn's small cry, she was already, in the truest and most secret sense, ancient beyond reckoning. Imagine, softly, what such a childhood must have been. A little girl no taller than a man's knee, with the round cheeks and the wide dark eyes of any small child of the Sietch, and yet behind those eyes moved a mind that had held conversations with itself across 10,000 years. She learned to walk with the memory of 100,000 who had walked before her. She spoke, when she chose to speak, with a calm and a knowing that made grown warriors fall silent and turn their faces away. For it is a strange and unsettling thing to be answered by a toddler in the measured words of a sage. The Fremen, who were not easily frightened by anything the desert could offer, grew uneasy in her presence, and some among them whispered that she was blessed, and some whispered that she was cursed, and in truth, she was neither and both. A being who was at once the youngest and the oldest person in any room she entered. Her powers, even in those early years, were formidable and quiet. She could read the hidden shape of a mind as easily as another child reads the colors of the sky. She carried the fighting arts of the Bene Gesserit within her small frame, learned not through practice, but through the living memory of those who had mastered them. In the great battle upon the plain of Arrakis, when the fate of the Imperium turned upon a single day, this child walked among the powerful and the deadly, and was untroubled, for she had died 1,000 deaths already in the memories she carried, and no threat of the living world could hold much terror for one who remembered so many endings. But now the story must lower its voice further still, for here lies the shadow, and it is a gentle and sorrowful shadow. Among the Bene Gesserit, the ancient sisterhood who had shaped bloodlines across the centuries toward some secret purpose, there was a word held in dread, and the word was abomination. It was the name they gave to any child who was born pre-awakened, as Aaliyah had been, born already filled with the crowd of ancestral lives. The sisterhood feared such children above almost all things, and they loathed them, and their fear was not cruelty for its own sake, but a terror born of understanding. For a reverend mother came to her inner memories as a grown woman, trained and armored, able to hold the multitude of the dead at a distance, and to let them counsel her without letting them rule her. A child awakened in the womb had no such armor. She was open. And the sisterhood believed, from long and bitter experience, that one of the ancient lives within such a child might rise up in the unguarded dark and seize the young mind for its own, wearing the child like a garment, so that a soul long dead might walk again and work its will upon the living world. This was the fate they most feared for Aaliyah, and it was why they named her Abomination and turned their veiled faces from her as from something unclean. And so this small girl, who had done no wrong and asked for none of it, carried through her days the knowledge that the most powerful sisterhood in the human universe regarded her very existence as a danger and a horror. She stood at the side of her brother the Emperor, honored in his court, feared by his enemies, wrapped in the robes of a princess of a ruling house. And yet within all that grandeur she was profoundly and unspeakably alone. There was no one in all the worlds who was as she was. Chani had her love and her people. Irulan had her books and her long patience. Jessica had her order and her memories held in their proper place. But Aaliyah had only the endless company of the dead within her and the wary distance of the living without, and between those two multitudes she walked a narrow and lonely path that no one else could see and no one else could share. There was a tenderness in her, for all her strange power, the tenderness of a child who wished, sometimes, only to be a child, to be held, and to be simple, and to be young. And there was a weight upon her that grew heavier as the years turned, the weight of all those inner voices pressing quietly against the walls of one small mind. The House of Atreides had risen very high, higher than any house before it, and it had gained a desert planet, a throne, a prophet, and an empire. But it had also brought into the world this luminous and lonely girl, and in her the line carried a shadow it did not yet fully understand, a shadow that would lengthen in the years still hidden beyond the horizon of this gentle tale. For now, let her rest in your thoughts as she truly was in those early days, a small figure in the great halls of Arrakis, ancient and innocent all at once, powerful and unbearably alone, the sister of the Emperor, and the mystery at the heart of his house. Up next in Chapter 16, the plot of the Guild, the Sisterhood, and the Tleilaxu, will drift softly away from the lonely child and into the quiet council chambers where three great powers lean close together in the lamplight, weaving in patient whispers a scheme against the one who had become their master. Chapter 16. The plot of the Guild, the Sisterhood, and the Tleilaxu far from the sleeping stillness of Aaliyah's chambers, in a quiet room whose walls held no windows, and whose air had been made gentle and cool. 4 strange visitors had gathered, and the story that turns now toward them moves as slowly as the drifting of dust across a shaded floor. There was no hurry in that room, and there would be no hurry here, for the thing that these 4 wove together was not a swift and sudden blow, but a patient and careful web, a design spun thread by thread over long and thoughtful hours, each strand laid down with the quiet deliberation of those who had been powerful for a very great while, and who feared, at last, that their long power was slipping away. The great powers of the known universe had watched the rise of Paul Atreides, who was called Muad'Dib, with a growing unease that had settled into their bones like a slow and heavy cold. He had come out of the deep desert of Arrakis, and he had taken the throne of the Padishah emperors, and now he sat above all the worlds as the single center around which everything turned. His name had become a banner beneath which countless warriors of the Fremen had spread across the stars, and where they went the old order fell away, softly at first and then completely, like sand sliding down the face of a dune. And so the powers that had ruled before him, each in its own long and settled fashion, began quietly to gather their fears together and to wonder among themselves whether there might yet be some gentle way to loosen his hold upon the throne of the whole of humankind. The first of these powers was the Spacing Guild, whose navigators folded space and carried the ships of all the worlds across the vast and silent gulfs between the stars. For long ages the guild had held a quiet and unshakable strength, because no vessel could travel the deep without its navigators, and no navigator could see the safe path through the folded darkness without the spice melange. And the spice came only from Arrakis, from the single desert world that Paul now ruled entirely, and so the guild, which had once bent every power to its will through its command of travel, found itself bent instead beneath the will of a single man. This the guild could not easily bear, and its representatives had come to the quiet room with a fear so deep and so old that it moved them at last toward the careful weaving of a plan. The second power was the Bene Gesserit, the ancient sisterhood of women who had labored across thousands of years to guide the bloodlines of the great houses toward a single hidden purpose. Through their long and secret breeding program, they had sought to bring forth one who would be called the Kwisatz Haderach, a male who could look into places where their sisters could not look, who could stand at the center of all the tangled threads of what had been and what might be. And now, that one had come. But he had come a generation too soon and outside their careful reckoning, and he had slipped entirely from their gentle hands. Paul Atreides was the very thing the sisterhood had spent an age preparing, and yet he served no purpose but his own, and this the Reverend Mothers found to be a wound that would not close. What they wanted from him now was not his throne, for thrones came and went beneath their long patience, but his precious bloodline, the seed of the Kwisatz Haderach, which they longed to draw back into their keeping before it should be lost to them forever. The third power was the strangest of the three, and its representative sat quietly among the others with a stillness that was not quite the stillness of an ordinary man. This was the Bene Tleilax, the secretive folk who worked with the very stuff of living flesh, who grew and shaped and altered the forms of life within their hidden vats and tanks, and who traded in wonders that other peoples found troubling to look upon. Their envoy was a face dancer named Scytale, and a face dancer was a being who could gather up his own features like soft clay and press them into a wholly new shape, so that the face he wore in 1 hour need not be the face he wore in the next. He could take on the look of another person, the very cast of their eyes and the set of their mouth and the sound of their voice, and wear it as easily as a traveler wears a cloak against the cold. And behind whatever face he chose, the Tleilaxu carried their own quiet ambitions, for they wished above all to gain a share of the genetic legacy of Muad'Dib, to hold within their tanks the pattern of the man who had risen so high. And so these three great powers, the guild that feared for the spice, the sisterhood that grieved for its lost creation, and the gene shapers who hungered for his living pattern, drew slowly together into a single quiet fellowship of purpose. Each of them held a piece of what the plan would need, and each of them held back a portion of trust, for none among them fully believed the others, and each watched the rest with the wary calm of old players who had sat at many tables before. Yet their shared fear of Paul was stronger than their old mistrust of one another, and it bound them together the way a slow frost binds loose grains into a single quiet crust. Into this careful gathering there came at last a fourth presence, one nearer to Paul than any of the others could ever be, and this was the Princess Irulan. She was the daughter of the fallen emperor, whom Paul had unseated, and she had been given to Paul in marriage as the seal upon his taking of the throne. Yet she was his wife in name, and in title only, for his heart belonged wholly to his Fremen beloved, to Chani of the desert, and Irulan sat beside the throne as a wife, who was never truly a wife, honored in her station, and yet left cold and childless and apart. She was of the Bene Gesserit herself, trained in their long patience, and she had turned her days toward the writing of the history of Muad'Dib, filling quiet pages with careful words. But beneath those pages a bitterness had gathered slowly, drop by patient drop, the bitterness of a woman set aside, and it was this bitterness that drew her into the edges of the plot, so that she became a thread of the web that reached into the very household of the man they meant to bring down. The scheme they wove together was not a thing of daggers in the dark. Or at least, not only that, for these were not simple assassins but patient shapers of long outcomes. They sought a way to unseat Paul from his terrible height, or, should that gentle loosening fail, to destroy him altogether, and yet in the same careful motion to capture and preserve the genetic legacy he carried, the bloodline that the sisterhood so dearly wanted, and the living pattern that the Tleilaxu so quietly craved. It was a design with many folds and many hidden turnings, and each of the plotters looked toward a slightly different reward at its end, so that even as they wove together, they held their own private threads apart, ready to be drawn tight when the moment came. And the Tleilaxu had brought to the weaving a gift of their own devising, a thing shaped in their tanks which they would offer to Paul as though it were kindness, and which would carry the plot into the heart of his court behind a face he had once loved. So the web was spun, slowly and without noise, in a room without windows, by powers that had ruled long and feared to rule no longer, and the quiet danger of it settled over the sleeping worlds like the softest fall of evening. Up next, in Chapter 17, The Gift of Metal Eyes, Hate and Duncan, Idaho, will follow the strange present the Tleilaxu carried out of their tanks and toward the throne, a restored man with silver eyes who wore the face of a friend long dead, and will rest a while in the gentle mystery of what he was and what he might yet remember. Chapter 17, The Gift of Metal Eyes, Hate and Duncan, Idaho, in the long hush that follows a difficult decision. When a mind has turned a hard thing over and set it gently aside, there comes a moment of stillness, and it was into such a stillness that the conspirators carried their strangest offering. The Guild, the Bene Gesserit, and the Tleilaxu had woven their plots against the Emperor Paul Muad'Dib with patience and with cold calculation, and among all the instruments they had prepared, one was made not of poison nor of coin, nor of whispered lie, but of a man who had once been dead, a man who had been grown again, cell by patient cell, in the great vats of the Bene Tleilax, from the flesh of one who had loved the House of Atreides more truly than his own life. His name, the name they gave to this new-made being, was Hate, and he stood in the receiving hall of the Emperor with a stillness that was almost a kind of peace, and his face was the face of Duncan Idaho. To understand the sorrow that lived inside this gift, one must remember Duncan Idaho as he had been in the years before Arrakis had swallowed so many things. He had been the swordmaster of the Atreides, a man of quick laughter and quicker blades, who had taught a boy named Paul the disciplines of steel and courage in the green and water-heavy halls of Caladan. When the Harkonnen treachery fell upon House Atreides, when the walls came down and the friends of Paul's childhood were scattered into death, Duncan Idaho had given his life so that the boy and his mother might escape into the desert and live. He had stood alone against many, and he had died with his loyalty unbroken, and Paul had carried that loss within him across all the years of his rising, the way a man carries a stone worn smooth by long holding. And now the Tleilaxu, the secretive gene-shapers who trafficked in the flesh of the dead, had gathered up what remained of that fallen swordmaster and had grown it anew. A Gola, they named such a being, a body regrown from dead cells, alive and breathing and warm, yet born without the memories of the life that had first shaped that flesh. So Hate walked, and Hate spoke, and Hate bore the very features of the beloved dead, the same strong hands, the same set of the shoulders, and yet behind that face there lived, so far as any could tell, a stranger. The eyes were the thing that marked him most, and they were the eyes the Tleilaxu had given him in place of the eyes that death had taken. They were metal, gleaming and faceted and without any human warmth, artificial orbs of dull silver that saw the world through a lattice of steel, and they turned upon the Emperor with a gaze that gave back no light of its own. Those metal Tleilaxu eyes had been a kindness of a sort, for they let the blind cells see, and yet they were also a mark and a strangeness, a small cruelty folded into the shape of a mercy, for they reminded all who looked upon Hate that this was not truly the friend of old, but a thing remade in the friend's image. Yet the gift did not end with the face and the eyes, for the Tleilaxu had trained this Gola with great and careful skill. They had made of him a Mentat, one of those rare human minds disciplined to compute and to reason with a precision that rivaled the forbidden thinking machines of ancient days, so that Hate could gather scattered facts and fold them into judgment as swiftly and as coldly as any advisor in the Imperium. And they had made of him also a philosopher of the Zensuni way, schooled in the quiet questions of being and time and the illusions of the self, so that his tongue carried riddles and his calm concealed depths that no ordinary servant possessed. A warrior's body, a Mentat's mind, a philosopher's patience, and the face of the most trusted friend the Emperor had ever known. It was a gift so rich and so layered that its very generosity should have warned him, for this was the heart of the matter, the poisoned center wrapped in so much wonder. Hate was not truly a gift at all. He was a weapon. The conspirators had shaped him and offered him with the darkest of intentions, meaning that the sight of the beloved dead walking and speaking should work upon the Emperor's heart like a slow acid, unsettling him, wounding him again and again in the old wound of his grief, until his judgment faltered and his certainty cracked. And deeper still than this, hidden within the Gola like a coiled spring within a lovely clock, there lay a design more terrible yet, a purpose set to awaken at its appointed hour, so that this remade Duncan might turn against the very man he wore the face of loving, and strike him down. Hate was courtesy and comfort on the surface, and beneath the surface he was a blade laid at the throat of an emperor who could not bring himself to look away. And the emperor knew it. That was perhaps the cruelest turning of the whole slow scheme, for Paul Muad'Dib, who saw so much of what was coming through the terrible unfolding of his prescient sight, understood that the gift was a snare, and understood that to accept it was to draw the danger close against his own chest. He knew, and still he could not refuse, for the face was the face of Duncan, and the heart cannot always be governed by the head, and there are losses so old and so deep that a man will hold even their shadow rather than let them go entirely. So he took the Ghola into his household, knowing, and the conspirators watched their instrument settle into place beside the throne. But woven through this darkness there ran a thread of aching wonder, a question that neither the plotters nor the emperor nor Hate himself could answer, and it was this: might the old Duncan yet live somewhere within the new? For the flesh remembered its shaping, and some among the Tleilaxu believed, and some among the wise suspected, that a Ghola pressed hard enough by the presence of its former life, confronted by the faces and the sorrows and the fierce necessities of the man it had once been, might crack the wall between the grown and the born, and remember. Somewhere in that regrown body, beneath the metal eyes and the mentat discipline, and the calm Zensuni riddles, there might sleep the loyalty of the Swordmaster, the laughter of Caledon, the love that had once traded a life for a boy's escape. It might be gone forever, dissolved with the death of the first flesh. Or it might be waiting, folded and dormant, needing only the right and terrible key to open it. And so the Emperor lived now beside a mystery in the shape of a friend, uncertain whether the eyes of dull metal hid an enemy engineered to destroy him, or the very soul he had mourned for years, and uncertain, most of all, whether the two might in the end prove to be the same. Hate moved quietly through the great halls, watchful and gentle and strange, and the household grew used to his silver gaze, and the plotters waited, and the old grief and the new hope lay down together in the Emperor's heart, and kept each other company through the long nights of Arrakis. Up next in Chapter 18, the Stoneburner and the Blind Prophet will drift gently into the shadow of a cruel and ancient weapon and the strange fate it would carry to the one who ruled a desert world, and will wander softly among the whispers of prophecy and the tender uncertainties of a sight that could see almost everything, and yet could not save itself from sorrow. Chapter 18. The Stoneburner and the Blind Prophet, in the quiet hours after Hate had come to walk the halls of the citadel, the great city of Arrakis went on breathing around its emperor, as cities do, warm with lamplight and slow with the movements of people who did not know how near the edge of things they truly stood. The desert lay beyond the walls, vast and patient and silver under the two moons, and Paul Muad'Dib, who had once been a boy running through the caves of the Fremen, now sat at the very center of an empire that stretched across 1,000 suns. He carried within him the weight of prescience, that terrible gift which let him gaze along the branching corridors of time, and he had grown weary in a way that no rest could ease. For a man who sees the shape of tomorrow can never be fully surprised by it, and can never quite lay it down. The enemies of Muad'Dib had been gathering for a long while in the shadows of his own greatness. There were among them Bene Gesserit's sisters, who wished the bloodline back in their keeping, and members of the Spacing Guild, who feared a mind that could see farther than their navigators. And there were Tleilaxu masters who trafficked in the shaping of flesh, and the bending of loyalty. Together they had woven a plot as fine as spider silk, and at its heart they had placed a weapon so old and so forbidden that most of the Imperium believed such things existed only in the histories of the ancient wars. It was called a stone burner. A stone burner was not a blade nor a poison nor any quiet thing. It was a device that fed upon atomic fire, and when it was loosed it sent forth a searing light, a radiance so fierce and so hungry that it would eat downward through rock and metal and earth for as long as its terrible fuel endured. The conspirators knew that such a weapon could not be aimed at Paul alone, for his guards were many and his fortress was deep. Instead, they meant to set it burning in the streets of the city itself, near a place where he might pass, trusting that its light would reach him and undo him without any hand ever needing to draw close. And so it came to be, on an evening that began like any other, that the stone burner was kindled in Arrakis. The night did not shatter with noise so much as it was drowned in brilliance, a light that poured outward silent and merciless, a light that no eye was made to hold. It reached across the low rooftops and along the narrow ways, and everywhere it touched the eyes of the living, it burned the sight from them. Men and women who had been walking home beneath the stars found themselves suddenly wrapped in a darkness they would carry forever. And among all those who stood within its reach that night was the Emperor himself. Paul Muad'Dib was left blind. The delicate flesh of his eyes, the eyes that Chani had loved and that a whole people had followed, was taken from him in that single wash of forbidden fire. By every law of the body he ought to have been cast down into helplessness, groping and stumbling like the least of men, dependent upon others to guide his feet and name the things before him. This is the doom that blindness brings to nearly all who suffer it, and the conspirators had counted upon exactly that ruin, imagining an emperor reduced to a fumbling shadow of himself, easily set aside. Yet what followed was a thing so strange and so quietly astonishing that it passed at once beyond ordinary understanding. For Paul rose, and Paul walked, and Paul moved through the world as though the light had never left him. He turned his face toward those who spoke, as if he saw them plainly. He stepped over thresholds without hesitation and reached for objects and found them at once beneath his hand. To all who watched, he seemed a man whose eyes still lived, and the marvel of it spread through the citadel like a hush. The secret of it lay in the very gift that had made him emperor. Paul's prescient vision, deepened across all his years upon the spice, had traced the path of his own life so completely, moment following moment, that he no longer needed his eyes to know where the world stood. He saw not with light falling upon flesh, but with the inward sight of one who already knows what will be. Each step had been foreseen, each gesture already lived within his mind before his body performed it, and so he walked through the ruined night as though reading from a book he had written long ago. Where another man would have found only darkness, Paul found the pattern of the future laid open, and he moved along it as surely as a traveler moves along a road walked 1,000 times. But this wonder was also a deepening of his sorrow. And here lay the truest cruelty of the whole design, for a man who can see only because his path is already fixed is a man who has lost the smallest freedom that sight might have given him. Ordinary eyes look upon the world and might glance aside, might turn toward the unexpected, might rest upon something new. Paul's inward sight showed him only what must come, and to depart from it even by a single step would have plunged him into total blackness, for outside the foreseen path there was nothing for him to perceive at all. He was thus bound to his own prophecy as tightly as a boat is bound to the current that carries it, able to see everything and yet forbidden to choose anything, a prisoner of the very gift that kept him walking upright among his people. He came to understand, in those slow days that followed, that the stone burner had done far more than steel his eyes. It had tightened the knot of fate around him until scarcely any slack remained. Every road but one had closed, and along that single remaining road he could see, with dreadful clearness, the shapes of the griefs that waited. He saw the peril drawing near to Chani, his beloved, the mother of the children she carried, and he saw how his own foreknowledge could neither turn that peril aside nor free him from the watching of it. To love, and to see plainly the loss that love would bring, and to be unable to look away from that seeing, was a burden heavier than any crown, and he carried it in silence, so that those around him might not be frightened by the depth of what he knew. The city healed slowly from the wound of that night. The blinded were tended, and among the Fremen a law spoke gently of those who could no longer see, though Paul, walking as one-sighted, stood apart even from that quiet mercy. His enemies had meant to break him, and had instead bound him more fully to his destiny. And this too he had foreseen, and this too he could not escape. Around him the empire turned, immense and unknowing, while at its center a blind man who saw all things moved through the corridors of his fortress, tender toward Chani, watchful over the child of prophecy still to come, and alone in a way that no companion could reach. The desert wind passed over Arrakis as it always had, and the moons rose, and the great slow machinery of what was fated to be went on turning quietly in the dark. Up next, in Chapter 19, What Dune, Messiah Will Bring, we'll follow the tightening threads of Paul's fate a little further, drawing near to the tender heart of Chani and the quiet turning of the story toward its gentle and sorrowful close. So let your breathing slow, and let the sands grow still as we go on. Chapter 19. What Dune, Messiah Will Bring. When the stone burner had done its cruel and silent work, and the light had been stolen from so many eyes upon the streets of Arrakis, there settled over the whole of the desert world a quietness that was different from any quietness that had come before it. A hush that was not the peace of rest, but the deep and thoughtful stillness of a story turning slowly toward its second half. In this gentle hush we may pause together, in the soft dark of the hour, and look ahead with calm and unhurried hearts toward the tale that is still to come. The tale that the second novel carries, the one called Dune Messiah, which waits beyond the desert of everything we have wandered through so far. For the first great story of Paul Atreides, the story of the boy who fell into the sand and rose again as a figure of prophecy, was in truth only the beginning of a much longer meditation, and the man who dreamed all of this into being, the writer Frank Herbert, had always wished for his readers to understand that the tale of the young hero was never meant to be a simple song of triumph. The second book, which is expected in the coming seasons to be shaped into a film by the same careful and patient hands that gave us the first two, turns its gaze from the wide and thunderous battles of empire toward something quieter and far more tender. A long and searching look at what it truly means to be a Messiah, and at the strange and heavy sorrow that waits for those whom the world decides to worship. Where the earlier chapters of the saga were filled with the roar of sandworms and the clash of great houses, the story of Dune Messiah is planned as something more inward, more hushed, a chamber piece rather than a storm, in which the loudest sound is often the beating of a troubled heart. It takes place some 12 years after the great victory upon Arrakis, and it finds Paul no longer a hunted boy, but an emperor seated upon a throne that stretches across 1,000 worlds, and yet it shows us, with great gentleness and great honesty, that the throne has not brought him happiness, and that the crown has grown heavy upon a brow that once knew only the freedom of the open dunes. This is the quiet truth that the coming story means to whisper to us, that a hero lifted too high can become a danger to the very people who lifted him, and that the fervor of those who follow a Messiah can spill outward across the stars in ways that no single man, however gifted with sight, can gather back into his hands. Paul had seen this danger long ago in his visions, the terrible flood of zeal that would be loosed in his name, and the second novel is expected to dwell upon the sorrow of a man who foresaw a great darkness and yet could not find any path that would let him step aside from it. In this way, the tale becomes a gentle warning, offered softly, that we should be careful of the heroes we raise up, and careful too of the longing within ourselves that wishes to hand our whole trust to a single shining figure. Yet for all its meditation upon empire and upon the peril of worship, the truest heart of the story that is still to come is not political at all, but wholly and quietly human, and it beats within the love between Paul and his beloved Chani, the desert woman who had walked beside him since the years of hiding among the Fremen. She remains his companion and his comfort, the one warm and simple thing in a life grown vast and cold with power, and the coming tale is expected to carry their love toward both its sweetest fulfillment and its deepest grief. For it is here that the twin children are to be born, the son and the daughter who will carry the bloodline forward into the ages that follow. These two children, whose coming is the tender center of the whole second story, are named Leto II, after the noble father whom Paul had lost so long ago upon the sands, and Ghanima, a soft and lovely name whose meaning speaks of a thing gained in battle, a spoil of war, a gift wrested from great cost. Their birth is planned to be at once the most joyful and the most sorrowful moment of the tale, a moment where new life arrives in the same breath that an old and cherished life departs, and the story lingers there, in that trembling place between welcome and farewell, with a tenderness that asks us only to feel and not to look away. For it is Chani whose fate is bound most closely to this birth, and the coming story is expected to hold her passing as its most quiet and most piercing sorrow, the loss of the one person whose love had kept Paul human through all the long cold years of rule. And when she is gone, the great emperor, who could see across time itself, finds that all his terrible power of vision cannot undo the smallest and most personal of griefs, and in this we may feel, softly and without any sharpness, the oldest truth of every human life, that no crown and no gift and no prophecy can shield the heart from the ache of loving and of losing. It is out of this deep and gentle sorrow that Paul makes the last great choice of his long story, and it is a choice unlike any that a triumphant hero is expected to make, for he does not cling to his throne, and he does not grasp at his power, and he does not use his sight to bind the future ever more tightly to his will. Instead, blinded now in the manner of the desert, following the ancient custom of the Fremen, who send their sightless ones out to be gathered by the sand, he chooses to rise from his throne and walk alone into the vast and open desert, giving himself back to the wilderness that had made him, laying down the whole weight of his godhood, and stepping quietly out of the story of empire and into the silence of the dunes. And so the tale that is still to come trades the grand and sweeping battles of the first story for something far more intimate and far more true, a small and private tragedy played out in quiet rooms and in the endless patience of the sand, a meditation upon love and loss and the terrible loneliness of being made into a god by people who wished only to be saved. It asks us to see the man behind the legend and to grieve for him a little, and to understand at last that the highest triumph in the whole of this long saga may be found not in the winning of a throne, but in the gentle courage of a soul that finally learns how to let go. Rest now in the soft knowledge of all that waits beyond this desert, the birth of the twins beneath the desert stars, the quiet farewell of a beloved companion, and the lonely and dignified walk of a blind man out into the sand he loved. Up next in Chapter 20, The Price of Being a Messiah, we'll wander together through the deeper cost that Paul carried in his heart, the strange loneliness of one who could see every tomorrow and yet could save no one dear to him, and we'll settle gently into the tender and unhurried question of what such a burden truly asks of anyone who is ever called a hero. Chapter 20. The Price of Being a Messiah. And so the long tale comes at last to its quiet resting place. And here, in the soft hours before sleep, it is right to sit with the whole of it, to let the sand settle and the desert grow still, and to ask gently what it all meant, and what it cost the young man who became more than a man upon the burning world of Arrakis. For the story of Paul Atreides is not truly a story of victory, though he won every battle, and it is not truly a story of a boy rising to a throne, though he sat upon the highest throne that had ever been. It is, beneath all its spice and all its silver dunes, a story about the price of being a Messiah, and about how heavy that word becomes when a living person must carry it across the years. Consider what Paul had gained by the end of his rising. He had gained a home world reclaimed, and the loyalty of the fierce Fremen, and the water of life within his blood, and the vision that could see across time as a traveler sees across a wide and open plain. He had become the Kwisatz Haderach, the one the Bene Gesserit had bred across 90 generations without ever meaning for such a one to belong to himself. He had become Muad'Dib, a name spoken with awe in the deep desert sietches, and Usul, the strength at the base of the pillar. To those who loved him closest, he held the spice, and to hold the spice was to hold the empire, for without it the great guild ships could not fold space, and without those ships the 10,000 worlds of the Imperium would drift alone in the dark. All of this he had gained, and it should have been enough for any dream a boy might dream on the green hills of Caladan long ago. Yet the deepest truth of the tale is that everything Paul gained came wrapped around a loss, the way the pearl grows in secret around a single grain of sand. The gift of prescience, the sight that let him see every branching path of what might be, was also a kind of prison with walls made of the future itself. For once a man can see all the paths, he can no longer walk any of them as a free traveler, choosing freely and wondering what lies ahead. Paul came to know the road before his feet ever touched it, and knowing it, he felt himself carried along it, less a walker than a leaf upon a river that had already chosen the sea. The mystery that makes each ordinary life so quietly precious, the sweet not knowing of the next dawn, was taken from him, and in its place lay a wide gray landscape where nothing could truly surprise him again. And there was a darker loss still, one that Paul saw coming across the horizon of his visions like a storm no wall could hold back. He saw the jihad. He saw his own name become a banner, and beneath that banner he saw the legions of the faithful pour out from Arrakis into the stars, carrying his green and black to world after world, and he saw them kill in his name, and burn in his name, and worship in his name, until the number of the dead rose beyond counting, into the billions. He did not want this. He tried, in the private rooms of his soul, to find some narrow path around it, some gentle turning that might spare so many lives, but the currents of history had grown too strong, and the belief of the people had become a force greater than any one heart, even the heart of the man they had chosen to adore. Here lies the warning that the whole saga speaks softly into the ear of anyone who will listen, a warning meant not to frighten but to teach. Paul Atreides was, by most measures, a good man. He was brave and thoughtful and loyal, and he grieved for those who suffered, and he wished for peace more than for power. And yet even a good man, when he is given absolute authority and the absolute belief of millions, becomes something that no single person can hold or steer, a force like a sandstorm or a tide. The danger was never that Paul was wicked. The danger was that the people needed a savior so badly that they made one. And once a savior is made, the savior belongs to the need, not to himself. The charismatic hero who gathers all hope into one figure is a beautiful and a perilous thing, for the same devotion that lifts him up can, in his name and beyond his reach, become an avalanche that buries the innocent. This is what it costs to be a Messiah, and Paul paid the whole of it. He paid with his freedom, giving up the simple right to be uncertain. He paid with his solitude. For the one who is worshipped stands always upon a height, and no one climbs up to stand beside him as an equal and a friend. To be adored is to be, in a quiet and aching way, profoundly alone, set apart by the very love that surrounds you, spoken to as a god when all you long for is to be spoken to as a person. And he paid, most heavily of all, with the weight of the countless dead who fell beneath his banner, a weight he carried in silence behind his composed and desert calm. In the later turning of the tale, when the great procession of triumph had passed and the empire lay firm in his grip, Paul came to understand that the truest thing he could still do was to refuse. Blinded in the flesh, yet seeing by his inner sight, worn thin by the years of vision and rule, he chose in the end to lay down what he had never truly wished to hold. He chose to walk away in the fashion of the Fremen, whose law held that the blind and the broken should give themselves back to the desert rather than be a burden upon the tribe. Paul walked out alone across the sand, out past the last lights of the city he had built, out into the vast and patient emptiness that had made him and would now receive him. He did not walk as a defeated man. He walked as one who had at last found the single free step left to him, the step away from the throne, away from the worship, away from the machinery of his own legend, into the honest dark. And the desert took him gently, as the desert takes all things in the fullness of time. For this is the last and largest truth of Arrakis, the one that outlasts every empire and every emperor. The sand does not remember the names of kings. The great worms move beneath the dunes as they have moved since before the first ship ever came, and the wind lifts the ridges and lays them down again, and the spice blooms and fades in its slow secret cycle far from any throne. Palaces rise and crumble, and banners are raised and forgotten, and the faithful and the fearful alike return in the end to dust, and through all of it, the desert simply endures, reclaiming its own, keeping its own deep and dreaming silence. Every empire is a brief warmth upon the sand, and the sand outlives them all. So let the story rest here, where it began and where it ends, upon the open desert beneath the wide and star-washed sky. Let the worms sleep in the deep. Let the Sayach grow quiet. Let the young man who carried too much finally set it down and be at peace, walking softly into the dark that asks nothing of him. The winds have grown gentle now, and the dunes lie still, and there is nothing left to fear and nothing left to do but breathe slowly and let it all go. The desert keeps its calm through every age, and now, in this hushed and easy hour, so may you, drifting down at last into a deep and untroubled rest. And so we come, softly, to the end of our journey. Tonight we drifted through a universe without thinking machines, the great powers that rule it, the sisterhood, and its long breeding program, and the spice that flows from the sands of Arrakis. We followed the fall of House Atreides, Paul and Jessica lost in the deep desert, the Fremen and their hidden Sayaches, and the visions that made a boy into a prophet. We watched Muad'Dib take the throne, the jihad he could not stop, and the 12 long years of holy war. The questions of Chani and Irulan, the burden carried by Alia, and the quiet plot of the guild, the sisterhood, and the Tleilaxu that waits to close around him. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each name and each grain of sand drift away from you, down through still dark water, until only calm remains. You are safe. You are warm. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If these long, slow stories help you sleep, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming.